As you settle in, preparing for night's rest, imagine your consciousness slowly detaching from the day's immediate concerns. The unresolved emails, the brief but meaningful conversations, tomorrow's plans, all begin to recede like shadows at dusk. Tonight, you embark on a different kind of journey, not across physical terrain, but through the landscape of moral inquiry that has shaped human civilization since we first developed the capacity to question our actions and their consequences. You may wonder why moral dilemmas matter. The answer lies in something you've likely experienced. That moment when you stand at a crossroads, knowing that whichever path you choose will leave something of value behind. Perhaps you faced situations where every available option seemed simultaneously right and wrong, where your heart pulled in one direction while your mind reasoned toward another. In these moments, you encounter the essence of moral complexity, the recognition that ethical life isn't merely about distinguishing good from evil, but navigating between competing goods and lesser harms in an imperfect world. Tonight, we'll explore these moral crossroads together, not as academic exercises, but as living questions that continue to define what it means to be human. I invite you to approach these dilemmas not with the urgency of finding immediate solutions, but with gentle curiosity. Some scenarios may feel uncomfortably familiar. Others might challenge you in unexpected ways. All of them belong to our shared human inheritance, the ongoing conversation about how to live well in a world of difficult choices. Imagine yourself walking along a quiet path as evening approaches. The air carries a slight chill, touching your skin with the gentle reminder of your embodied existence. Somewhere nearby, leaves rustle in a soft breeze. This path has existed in various forms throughout human history. It is the path of moral reflection where ordinary people and great ethical thinkers alike have walked, pondering the nature of right action and the foundations of a good life. You're not alone on this path. Beside you walks a figure, neither young nor old, neither definitively male nor female, who embodies the spirit of ethical inquiry itself. This is Sophia, whose name in Greek means wisdom. When you look directly at Sophia, you see a reflection of your own questioning mind, your own capacity for moral reasoning. Sophia speaks, and the voice seems to emerge both from your companion and from within your own thoughts. The journey we're about to undertake, Sophia tells you, begins with perhaps the most fundamental ethical question of all. How do we balance the good of individuals against the well-being of the many? This tension between individual rights and collective welfare has challenged moral thinkers from ancient philosophers to modern ethicists, from religious prophets to secular humanists. As Sophia speaks, you feel yourself sinking deeper into receptive awareness. The path before you seems both more vivid and more dreamlike. The boundary between your conscious thoughts and the narrative unfolding before you becomes pleasantly blurred. You are both participant and observer in this journey, considering these dilemmas and being considered by them. Before we explore specific scenarios, Sophia continues, I want to invite you to notice something about the very nature of moral dilemmas. When you face a genuine ethical dilemma, you enter a space where certainty gives way to ambiguity, where moral clarity blurs into shades of gray. There's something both unsettling and liberating about these moments. They challenge our desire for simple answers, yet they also open us to deeper wisdom that transcends rigid rules or absolute principles. You notice your breathing has naturally slowed. Each breath now feels like a gentle tide, carrying you deeper into contemplation. The twilight deepens around you on the path, and stars begin to appear overhead, points of clarity in the vast unknown. Your body feels heavier, more connected to the earth beneath you, while your mind feels increasingly spacious, ready to receive the moral questions that Sophia is about to share. The dilemmas we'll explore tonight, Sophia says, have been considered in different forms across cultures and throughout time. They emerge whenever humans pause long enough to question the moral fabric of their actions. These are not merely theoretical problems. They are invitations to experience ethical thinking differently, to see beyond simplistic divisions of right and wrong. Some may challenge your most basic moral assumptions. Others may articulate tensions you've carried within you without having words to express them. As you listen, you begin to feel a subtle shift in your perception. The path around you seems to expand, becoming a metaphor for moral consciousness itself, a cultivated space where ethical insights can take root, grow, and sometimes transform into something entirely unexpected. You're aware of the weight of your body sinking deeper into comfort, while your mind remains gently alert, receptive to the wisdom that has sustained moral seekers throughout the ages. Are you ready? Sophia asks, though it's not really a question requiring an answer. It's an invitation to presence, to full engagement with the journey about to unfold. You feel yourself nodding almost imperceptibly, and with that small gesture of consent, you cross the threshold into the realm of moral inquiry that has captivated the greatest ethical minds in human history and continues to resonate in the dilemmas we face today. The first stars now shine overhead with remarkable clarity, each one a point of wonder in the darkening sky. Your eyelids may feel heavy at times, and that's perfectly natural. This journey is designed to accompany you even as you drift between wakefulness and sleep, planting seeds of moral reflection that will continue to unfold in your dreams and perhaps emerge in new forms when morning comes. Our first exploration, Sophia begins, concerns a dilemma that appears deceptively simple but contains profound complexity. Imagine you're standing by a set of train tracks when you notice a runaway trolley barreling down the line. Ahead, 5 people are tied to the tracks, unable to escape. You stand next to a lever that can divert the trolley to a different track. However, you notice that on this side track, one person is tied down. You have a choice. Do nothing and allow the trolley to kill 5 people, or pull the lever, diverting the trolley to kill one person instead. The scene materializes around you with startling clarity. The tracks stretching before you, the rumble of the approaching trolley, the horrible recognition of the choice you face. You can practically feel the cold metal of the lever under your palm, waiting for your decision. This thought experiment, Sophia explains, known as the trolley problem, was introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot and elaborated by Judith Jarvis Thomson. On the surface, the utilitarian answer seems straightforward. Pull the lever, sacrifice one to save 5, producing the greatest good for the greatest number. But something in us hesitates, doesn't it? There's a difference between allowing harm to occur and actively causing it, even if the numerical outcome is better. By pulling the lever, you become an active participant in causing someone's death who would otherwise have been safe. The path around you seems to shimmer slightly as you prepare to delve into this first great moral dilemma. Your mind now perfectly balanced between alertness and tranquility, ready to receive the wisdom of the ages as you continue this journey into the heart of ethical complexity. The trolley scenario begins to transform, revealing variations and deeper implications that challenge simple utilitarian calculations with questions of agency, intention, and the moral significance of action versus inaction. What if, Sophia asks, her voice gentle but probing, instead of pulling a lever, you could stop the trolley by pushing a large person off a footbridge into its path? The math remains the same, 1 life versus 5, but our moral intuitions often shift dramatically. What changes? Is it the difference between redirecting an existing threat and creating a new one? Is it the violation of using a person merely as a means to an end rather than as an end in themselves? Or perhaps it's the visceral intimacy of pushing someone to their death versus the mechanical distance of pulling a lever. As you ponder these variations, the trolley dilemma reveals itself not as a simple mathematical problem, but as a window into competing moral frameworks that have shaped human ethical thought for centuries. The path before you divides and subdivides, representing the branching implications of this foundational ethical question that will guide our journey through increasingly complex moral terrain. The trolley continues its inexorable journey through your mind as Sophia guides you deeper into its moral implications. The tracks before you seem to multiply, creating a complex network of possible paths and outcomes, each representing different ethical frameworks humans have developed to navigate such dilemmas. What the trolley problem reveals, Sophia continues, her voice flowing like calm water over stones, is the tension between consequentialist ethics, which judges actions by their outcomes, and deontological ethics, which evaluates actions based on whether they adhere to moral duties or rules regardless of consequences. The utilitarian consequentialist looks at the numbers, 5 lives versus 1, and sees a clear mathematical answer. The Kantian deontologist sees the moral prohibition against using a person merely as a means and recognizes a boundary that perhaps shouldn't be crossed, even for good outcomes. As Sophia speaks, the path you're walking gradually transforms. The simple dirt trail becomes a set of ancient stone scales, large enough to walk upon. You find yourself traversing the balance beam at the center, while to either side hang massive plates representing competing moral values. With each step, you feel the delicate equilibrium shift beneath your feet. This balance, Sophia explains, between outcome-based and principle-based ethics represents one of humanity's enduring moral tensions. But there's a third perspective we might consider. Virtue ethics, originating with Aristotle, asks not what produces the best outcome, or what rule must I follow, but rather, what would a person of good character do in this situation? It focuses not on calculating consequences or applying rules, but on developing the moral wisdom to respond appropriately to complex situations. The scales beneath your feet subtly transform again, the beam widening slightly as if acknowledging this third approach that seeks balance through character rather than through rigid adherence to either consequences or rules. You notice how the path feels more stable when you walk its center, maintaining equilibrium between competing moral pulls. Let's move beyond the abstract trolley, Sophia suggests, to consider how these tensions manifest in real human dilemmas. Imagine you're a doctor with 5 patients, each needing an organ transplant to survive: a heart, 2 kidneys, a liver, and lungs. A healthy traveler with no family or connections comes to your hospital for a routine checkup. You discover they're a perfect match for all 5 patients. Would you be justified in sacrificing this one person to save your 5 patients? The scenario materializes around you. the antiseptic smell of a hospital, the beeping of monitors tracking failing organs, the weight of medical knowledge telling you these 5 will die without transplants, and the unsuspecting traveler, perfectly healthy, reading a magazine in your waiting room. You feel the immediate moral revulsion at the thought of harvesting this person's organs without consent, even to save 5 lives. Almost everyone rejects this scenario as morally monstrous, Sophia observes, even though the numerical calculus matches the basic trolley problem. Why? Perhaps because medicine has its own moral foundation built on the principle, first, do no harm. Perhaps because the doctor actively violates trust and creates harm rather than redirecting an existing threat. Or perhaps because we intuitively recognize that a society where doctors might harvest organs from the healthy would destroy the trust essential to medicine and ultimately produce worse outcomes for everyone. The hospital scene dissolves, and you find yourself back on the balanced scales, now understanding more deeply how these abstract ethical frameworks interact with professional ethics and social contexts. The scales gently rock beneath your feet, finding a new equilibrium that accounts for these additional moral considerations. This brings us to a crucial insight, Sophia says, her voice taking on a warmer tone. Moral dilemmas rarely exist in isolation. They're embedded in relationships, institutions, and social contexts that add layers of complexity. The same action performed in different contexts or relationships might carry entirely different moral meanings. As if responding to this observation, the path of scales now appears to be suspended over a landscape that shifts between different settings: a family home, a hospital, a courtroom, a battlefield. You realize that the moral weight of the same action might be entirely different depending on which of these contexts lies below. Consider how this contextual understanding transforms another classic dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine you're hiding Jewish refugees in Nazi-occupied territory during World War II. Officers knock on your door asking if you're harboring Jews. Would you tell the truth, potentially condemning innocent people to death, or would you lie to protect them? The scene crystallizes around you. The cramped attic where frightened eyes watch the ceiling, the heavy boots on your front porch, the pounding heart in your chest as you face the officer at your door. You feel the moral tension between the general duty to honesty and the specific obligation to protect innocent lives from grievous harm. Immanuel Kant, champion of deontological ethics, famously argued that lying is always wrong, even in such extreme circumstances, Sophia explains. Yet many find this position untenable, recognizing that the duty not to participate in grave injustice might override the general obligation to truthfulness. This suggests that moral duties may exist in a hierarchy, with some obligations taking precedence over others in specific contexts. The Nazi officer fades, and you find yourself again on the balanced scales, which now appear to have multiple levels, suggesting this hierarchy of moral duties. Some principles carry greater weight than others, and part of moral wisdom involves discerning which takes precedence in a given situation. What's emerging in our exploration, Sophia observes, is the recognition that moral reasoning isn't simply about applying a single framework, consequentialism, deontology, or virtue ethics, but about navigating the complex interplay between them. Sometimes, the wisest approach involves asking multiple questions. What consequences will this action produce? What duties or rights are at stake? What would a person of good character do? How do the specific relationships and contexts involved shape the moral meaning of this choice. The scales beneath you widen further, becoming a more substantial path that incorporates elements of all these considerations. You notice that as the path broadens, your steps feel more confident, though the fundamental tensions remain. There is still no single, simple answer to complex moral dilemmas, but there are more robust frameworks for thinking through them. Let's explore how these frameworks apply to a dilemma you might encounter in everyday life, Sophia suggests. Imagine you discover that a close friend has been betraying your trust in a significant way, perhaps lying about something important or breaking a promise they made to you. You must decide whether to confront them, potentially damaging the friendship but maintaining your integrity and self-respect, or remain silent to preserve harmony but at the cost of authentic relationship. This scenario feels more intimately familiar than the previous ones. The sting of betrayal, the anxiety of confrontation, the desire to maintain peace, conflicting with the need for honesty. You can practically feel the knot in your stomach as you contemplate this all too common moral crossroads. Here again, different ethical frameworks suggest different approaches, Sophia explains. A consequentialist might weigh the likely outcomes of confrontation versus silence, considering both short-term harmony and long-term relationship health. A deontologist might focus on duties of honesty and the right to be treated with respect. A virtue ethicist might ask what qualities of character, courage, compassion, integrity, forgiveness are needed to respond wisely to this breach of trust. As you contemplate these approaches, you notice that the path of scales now passes through a forest where the trees bear familiar faces, friends, family, colleagues, and others with whom you share bonds of trust and obligation. You realize that much of everyday morality exists in this forest of relationships, where our actions continually affect and are affected by those to whom we're connected. This relational dimension of ethics has been particularly emphasized by care ethics, Sophia notes, which grew from feminist critiques of traditional moral theories. Care ethics suggests that moral reasoning should begin not with abstract principles or impersonal calculations, but with attention to the specific needs, vulnerabilities, and interdependencies within relationships. It asks us to consider not just what is the right action, but how can I respond with appropriate care to this particular person in this specific context? The forest around you takes on a new quality. The trees no longer stand as separate entities, but are connected by an intricate network of visible roots and branches that intertwine and support each other. This living system of interconnection represents the web of care and responsibility that underlies moral life. As we continue our journey, Sophia says, keep in mind that moral dilemmas arise precisely because legitimate values come into conflict. If the choice were simply between good and evil, we would face a moral problem, but not a true dilemma. What makes these situations so challenging is that something of genuine value must be sacrificed whatever choice we make. The scales beneath your feet subtly emphasize this point, tilting slightly first one way and then another, as if to demonstrate that perfect balance may remain elusive. Yet, there is a certain grace in this imperfection, a recognition that moral life involves continuous discernment rather than the application of fixed formulas. Now, Sophia says, her voice taking on a more contemplative tone, let's explore how these ethical tensions manifest in decisions about who deserves our help and how we should allocate limited resources. Imagine you direct a small nonprofit with funds to help only some of many deserving people in need. How do you decide? Do you help the most desperate cases first? Those most likely to benefit? Those closest to you geographically or culturally? Those who have received least help in the past? Each criterion reflects a different understanding of fairness and compassion. The forest of relationships gradually opens into a wider valley where you can see many people in varying states of need. Some are nearby and clearly visible, others distant and partially obscured. Some suffer acute distress, others chronic deprivation. Some could be helped with simple interventions, others would require complex, sustained assistance. The limited resources at your disposal appear as a small but precious bundle you carry, woefully inadequate to meet all the need you can see. This scenario, Sophia explains, touches on questions of distributive justice and the scope of moral concern. It asks how far our moral obligations extend and on what basis we should prioritize when we cannot help everyone. These questions have taken on global dimensions in our interconnected world, where we're increasingly aware of suffering far beyond our immediate communities, yet remain limited in our capacity to address it all. As you contemplate this expanded moral horizon, the valley before you extends to the limits of vision, revealing the vast scope of human need against which any individual's resources seem insignificant. Yet rather than overwhelming you, this vista invites a deeper reflection on the principles that might guide your moral choices given these inevitable limitations. What emerges from this dilemma, Sophia observes, is not a single correct formula for distributing help, but an invitation to examine the values implicit in different approaches. Prioritizing the worst off reflects a commitment to compassion for the most suffering. Focusing on efficiency, helping those who can benefit most from limited resources, reflects prudent stewardship. Attending first to those nearest to you acknowledges the special obligations that arise from relationship and proximity. Each approach has genuine moral weight. The valley begins to organize itself into different regions representing these approaches, not as mutually exclusive territories, but as overlapping considerations that might be balanced differently depending on specific circumstances. You notice that the path of scales continues through this complex moral landscape, inviting you to maintain equilibrium among these competing values rather than simply choosing one over the others. As we prepare to explore our next moral territory, Sophia says, notice how the dilemmas we've considered thus far all involve tensions between legitimate moral claims. The trolley problem balances the duty not to harm against the imperative to prevent greater harm. The question of confronting a friend balances honesty against kindness. The distribution of limited resources balances different conceptions of fairness and obligation. What defines a true moral dilemma is precisely this conflict between values, each of which makes a legitimate claim on our conscience. The path of scales now approaches what appears to be a mountain range in the distance, representing the more challenging moral terrain that lies ahead. Yet before beginning this ascent, the path circles a clear pool of water where you can rest momentarily and see your own reflection. In this mirror of self-awareness, you glimpse not only your physical appearance, but the moral commitments and values that shape your approach to ethical dilemmas. Take a moment, Sophia suggests, to notice your own responses to the dilemmas we've explored thus far. Which considerations carry the most weight for you? Where do you find yourself most torn between competing values? These patterns of moral intuition, what philosophers call your considered judgments, form an important starting point for ethical reflection, even as they remain open to refinement through further exploration and dialogue. As you gaze at your reflection in the still pool, you become aware of the moral intuitions that have guided your responses to the scenarios Sophia has presented. You notice where your judgments align with particular ethical frameworks and where they seem to draw from multiple approaches. This moment of self-reflection prepares you for the more challenging moral territory that lies ahead, as the path of scales begins its ascent into the mountains of increasingly complex ethical dilemmas. As you leave the reflective pool behind, the path of scales begins its gentle ascent into the mountains. The air grows slightly cooler against your skin, carrying the scent of pine and earth. With each step, you feel a subtle shift in perspective, your view expanding to encompass more of the moral landscape stretching out below and beyond. Now, Sophia says, her voice resonating with the quiet gravity of the mountains, let's explore a fundamental question underlying many ethical dilemmas. Where do we draw the circle of moral concern? Who or what deserves direct moral consideration? Throughout history, humans have expanded this circle, from immediate family to tribe to nation to all of humanity. But where does it end? Does it include future generations, non-human animals, ecosystems, artificial intelligences? The boundaries of our moral community shape how we understand our ethical obligations. As Sophia speaks, you notice the path is now circumscribed by a luminous circle that pulses and shifts, sometimes contracting to include only what lies immediately before you, sometimes expanding to encompass the distant horizons, the animals you pass, the trees and mountains themselves, and even flickering images of people not yet born. Consider this dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine you must decide whether to approve a development project that would bring significant economic benefits to an impoverished community today, but would irreversibly damage an ecosystem and deplete resources needed by future generations. The current community strongly favors the project because of their pressing needs. How do you weigh the very real suffering of people alive now against the potential suffering of those who do not yet exist? The scene materializes around you, a community meeting where anxious faces plead for the development that could lift them from poverty, while through the windows you can see the ancient forest that would be destroyed, its complex web of life representing both intrinsic value and resources for generations yet unborn. You feel the weight of this decision, the legitimate pull of both immediate compassion and long-term responsibility. This dilemma, Sophia explains, reveals the challenge of intergenerational ethics. Those not yet born cannot advocate for themselves in current decision-making. Yet our actions profoundly shape the world they will inherit. Do we have moral obligations to future people? If so, how do we balance these against our obligations to those suffering now? What discount rate, if any, should we apply to future benefits and harms compared to present ones? The circle around your path expands to include transparent figures representing future generations, children, grandchildren, and those more distant still. Though less substantial than the current community members, their presence exerts a moral gravity that affects your balance on the scales. You notice how the path shifts beneath you, requiring a different kind of equilibrium that accounts for this temporal extension of ethical concern. Similar questions arise, Sophia continues, when we consider our moral obligations to non-human animals. Most agree that animal suffering matters morally, but how much weight should it carry compared to human interests? Is it justifiable to use animals for food, clothing, research, or entertainment if doing so serves human needs or preferences? Where should we draw the line between necessary use and exploitation? The circle of concern shifts again, now expanding laterally to include the various animals you see along your path. Deer watching cautiously from the forest edge, birds singing in the branches overhead, insects busy in the undergrowth, and even domesticated animals visible in distant pastures. Their sentience registers as a kind of silent claim on your moral attention. Peter Singer, Sophia notes, argues that the capacity to suffer, not species membership, should determine moral consideration. If a being can experience pain, that pain matters morally, regardless of whether the being is human or non-human. This perspective dramatically expands the circle of moral concern to include countless sentient beings whose interests are routinely overshadowed by human preferences rather than needs. You notice how this expanded circle creates new complexities in maintaining your balance on the scales. Each step requires awareness not only of human interests, but of the impact your choices might have on other feeling beings who share the world with you. The path narrows slightly, demanding more careful attention to maintain equilibrium among these expanded moral considerations. The circle can expand further still, Sophia observes, to include ecosystems and the biosphere itself. Deep ecology suggests that nature has intrinsic value independent of its usefulness to humans. On this view, we have moral obligations not just to individual sentient beings, but to the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community as a whole. This perspective has roots in indigenous worldviews that have long recognized humans as participants in, rather than masters of, the natural world. The circle now encompasses the entire visible landscape, mountains, forests, rivers, and sky, all pulsing with the same moral luminosity that previously marked only human and animal life. You sense how this holistic perspective further transforms the balance required on your path, as ecological integrity itself becomes a value to be weighed alongside individual welfare. These expanding circles of concern, Sophia explains, create increasingly complex moral calculations. Consider a dilemma involving competing claims across these boundaries. A medical research project would require animal testing that causes suffering, but promises treatments that could alleviate substantial human suffering. The animals cannot consent, while the humans who might benefit are not yet patients. How do you weigh these different kinds of suffering and benefit across the boundaries of species and time? The path before you now crosses a series of stepping stones across a clear mountain stream. Each stone represents a different focal point of moral concern: human welfare, animal suffering, ecosystem integrity, future generations. To cross successfully requires touching each stone, acknowledging each moral consideration, while maintaining the dynamic balance that allows forward movement through this complex ethical terrain. What complicates these dilemmas further, Sophia notes, is that expanding the circle of moral concern doesn't tell us how to weigh different interests when they conflict. Even if we agree that animal suffering matters morally, does it matter equally to comparable human suffering? If not, what is the exchange rate? Similar questions arise for weighing present versus future interests, individual welfare versus ecosystem integrity, and so on. As you carefully traverse the stepping stones, you notice that they sit at different heights above the water, some higher, some lower, suggesting the different weights these considerations might carry in moral deliberation. Yet no stone can be entirely skipped. Each requires at least some acknowledgement to complete the crossing. This question of moral weight, Sophia continues, connects to deeper philosophical issues about the basis of moral consideration itself. Is it sentience, the capacity to feel pleasure and pain? Is it agency, the capacity to form and pursue goals? Is it relationship, being bound together in communities of interdependence? Each criterion draws the circle differently and suggests different priorities when interests conflict. Having crossed the stream, your path now ascends more steeply into a mountain pass where the air grows thinner. This represents the intellectual challenge of these more abstract philosophical questions that underlie concrete moral dilemmas. Yet even as the reasoning becomes more rarefied, the path remains grounded in the earth, reminding you that these philosophical issues have practical implications for lived ethical choices. Let's consider a specific scenario that brings these questions into focus, Sophia suggests. Imagine you're part of a community deciding whether to protect a large wilderness area or open it to development. The wilderness is home to several endangered species and indigenous plants found nowhere else. Development would create jobs in a region with high unemployment and could fund better schools and healthcare. The community is divided, with some prioritizing economic opportunity and others environmental protection. The mountain pass opens onto a high valley where you can see both possibilities laid out before you. On one side, a pristine wilderness teeming with biodiversity. On the other, a developed area with new homes, businesses, schools, and medical facilities. Between them runs your path of scales, requiring balance between these competing visions of value. This scenario, Sophia explains, reveals how abstract questions about the circle of moral concern translate into concrete community decisions. Those who include only human interests in their moral calculations will weigh the jobs, education, and healthcare heavily. Those who extend moral consideration to non-human species and ecosystems will place greater weight on biodiversity and wilderness preservation. Those who consider future generations might evaluate which approach better serves long-term human flourishing. As you walk through this valley of competing visions, you notice that the path occasionally branches, suggesting that some decisions require not just balance, but actual choice between different conceptions of value. Yet the branches always rejoin further along, indicating that even after such choices, the fundamental task of moral balance continues with whatever values remain in play. What's particularly challenging about such community decisions, Sophia observes, is that they require not just individual moral deliberation, but collective ethical reasoning. Different people draw their circles of concern differently and weigh values differently within those circles. Democratic societies need processes for making defensible moral decisions despite these differences, processes that respect plurality while still allowing collective action. The valley now opens onto a meadow where you see groups of people engaged in various forms of deliberation, some in heated debate, others in quiet dialogue, some voting, others seeking consensus through patient discussion. These represent different approaches to collective moral decision-making in pluralistic societies. This challenge of collective ethics, Sophia continues, raises questions about the relationship between morality and democracy. Should moral questions be decided by majority vote? Should some moral concerns, like basic rights, be placed beyond democratic contestation? How do we balance respect for moral diversity with the need for shared ethical standards that enable cooperative social life? The path through the meadow weaves between the deliberating groups, suggesting that there is no single perfect process for collective moral decision-making. Each approach has strengths and limitations, and different situations might call for different processes depending on the stakes involved and the degree of moral diversity present. As we navigate these questions of the moral community, Sophia says, we encounter a fundamental tension between impartiality and special obligation. Impartiality suggests that every being within our circle of concern deserves equal moral consideration. That location, relationship, and identity shouldn't affect moral weight. Yet we also recognize special obligations to those with whom we have particular relationships: family, friends, community members, fellow citizens. The path now traverses a series of concentric circles emanating outward from what appears to be your own reflection in the center. The innermost circles represent those closest to you, while the outer circles extend to distant strangers, future people, other species, and the biosphere as a whole. You notice that while the path acknowledges all these circles, it spends more time in some than others, suggesting the reality of special obligations within a framework of universal concern. This tension, Sophia explains, appears in many practical dilemmas. Should you donate to charities that help distant strangers when family members or neighbors also need assistance? Should your country prioritize its own citizens' welfare or allocate resources based on global need? Should humans protect other species even at significant cost to human convenience or economic benefit? There are no simple formulas for resolving these tensions, but thoughtful moral reasoning requires acknowledging both the reality of special obligations and the moral pull of impartial concern. As you continue along the path, the concentric circles gradually fade, but their imprint remains visible in the subtle patterns of the ground beneath your feet, a reminder that the tension between partiality and impartiality forms an inescapable feature of the moral landscape through which you travel. What these dilemmas of moral community reveal, Sophia observes, is that ethical questions aren't just about how to act, but about who we are and how we understand our place in the world. Do we see ourselves primarily as individuals with personal projects and close relationships, as citizens of particular political communities, as members of humanity, as participants in the community of all sentient beings, as elements in the great web of life? Each self-understanding suggests different moral priorities and obligations. The path now approaches what appears to be a mirror fixed in the mountainside, not a small hand mirror, but a full-length reflection that shows not just your physical form, but somehow your moral identity as well. In this reflection, you can see the implicit boundaries of your own circle of concern, the relative weights you assign to different types of moral consideration, and the balance you strike between impartial principles and specific relationships. As we prepare to explore our next moral territory, Sophia says, take a moment to notice your own intuitions about these questions of moral community. Where do you draw your circle of concern? What beings or systems do you include within it? How do you balance universal principles with special obligations? These patterns of moral identity, often unconscious but revealed in our intuitive responses to dilemmas, form the foundation from which we approach more specific ethical questions. As you gaze at your moral reflection, you become aware of the boundaries and priorities that shape your own ethical sensibility. This self-knowledge doesn't resolve the dilemmas, but it creates greater consciousness about the values and assumptions you bring to moral deliberation. With this deepened self-awareness, you turn from the mirror and continue along the path as it winds toward a series of human dwellings visible in the distance, representing the next territory of moral exploration, where questions of justice and fairness in human societies await your consideration. As you approach the human dwellings you glimpsed from afar, they gradually resolve into a complex city, neither ancient nor futuristic, but a blend of architectural styles that suggests the accumulated wisdom and ongoing experiments of human social organization across time. Streets and buildings form intricate patterns, representing the institutional structures through which humans attempt to create just and flourishing societies. People move through these spaces, their interactions governed by both formal rules and informal norms that constitute the social fabric. Now, Sophia says, her voice taking on notes that resonate with the hum of the city, we enter the realm of social justice, the domain of questions about how to organize societies in ways that distribute benefits and burdens fairly. What constitutes a just society? How should we allocate resources, opportunities, rights, and responsibilities among members? What do we owe each other as fellow participants in shared social systems? As you walk the city streets with Sophia, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed again, now incorporated into the very paving stones of the path, a reminder that questions of balance and fairness underlie every aspect of social organization. Each paving stone bears symbols representing different conceptions of justice that humans have developed throughout history. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine a society designing its basic economic institutions. Should it prioritize maximizing total prosperity, even if this creates significant inequality between citizens? Or should it prioritize more equal distribution, even if this might reduce overall wealth creation? Different theories of justice offer different answers to this basic trade-off between efficiency and equality. The city around you shifts to illustrate these alternatives. On one street, you see impressive wealth creation, gleaming buildings, technological innovation, material abundance, but also striking disparities between luxurious enclaves and struggling neighborhoods. On a parallel street, you see more modest but more equally distributed prosperity, with fewer extremes of affluence and deprivation. Both visions contain genuine goods. Neither perfectly realizes all values simultaneously. This tension, Sophia explains, has been approached in different ways by major political philosophers. John Rawls proposed his difference principle, that inequalities are justified only to the extent that they benefit the least advantaged members of society. Robert Nozick countered with an entitlement theory that focuses on the justice of processes rather than patterns of distribution. If resources are acquired and transferred through just means, the resulting distribution, however unequal, is just. Each theory prioritizes different aspects of fairness. The parallel streets you observe now incorporate features representing these theoretical approaches. Rawls' vision showing how inequalities might be harnessed to improve conditions for the least advantaged. Nozick's demonstrating how freely chosen exchanges might create unequal but procedurally just outcomes. Neither street appears perfect. Each manifests different aspects of what justice might entail. Other approaches, Sophia continues, focus less on abstract principles and more on capabilities and functioning. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum argue that justice involves ensuring everyone has core capabilities necessary for dignified human functioning, health, education, political voice, and so on. This capabilities approach asks not just about the distribution of resources, but about people's actual freedom to live flourishing lives. The cityscape shifts again to reveal neighborhoods where the focus is neither on resource distribution nor procedural fairness alone, but on developing institutions that cultivate human capabilities across all segments of society. Schools, healthcare facilities, public forums, and creative spaces feature prominently, suggesting this broader conception of what justice requires. These different theories, Sophia observes, aren't merely academic exercises. They shape how we approach concrete policy dilemmas. Should healthcare be distributed according to ability to pay, medical need, social contribution, or equal access rights? Should education funding be equal across communities or allocate more resources to disadvantaged students? Should taxation be flat, progressive, or focused on consumption rather than income? Each approach embodies different understandings of fairness. As you walk, you pass government buildings, schools, hospitals, and other institutions, each designed according to different conceptions of just distribution. You notice how these architectural choices reflect deeper assumptions about what people deserve, what they owe each other, and how social cooperation should be structured to balance individual freedom with collective welfare. What complicates these questions further, Sophia notes, is that justice involves not just distribution of benefits, but also remediation of historical wrongs. Consider societies built on histories of conquest, enslavement, or systematic discrimination. What obligations do current generations have to address these historical injustices? What forms should reparations or reconciliation take? How do we balance forward-looking approaches to creating just institutions with backward-looking obligations to redress past wrongs? The city now reveals neighborhoods bearing visible marks of historical injustice, areas where development was stunted by past discrimination, monuments that tell one-sided historical narratives, boundaries that still reflect former segregation patterns. Alongside these, you see efforts at transformation, community development initiatives, inclusive historical markers, integration projects, representing different approaches to addressing this complex moral terrain. This question of historical justice, Sophia explains, raises deeper issues about collective responsibility and intergenerational obligations. Can present generations be morally responsible for actions they didn't personally commit? Do we inherit obligations from historical injustices that benefited us even indirectly? Does membership in a society that committed past wrongs create special duties to address their ongoing effects? These questions have no easy answers, but thoughtful moral reasoning requires engaging with them. The path now passes a series of courthouses, each representing different approaches to historical justice. From tribunals focused on establishing truth to compensation programs to systemic reforms addressing ongoing structural inequality. No single approach appears sufficient. Each captures different aspects of what justice might require in the shadow of historical wrongs. Another dimension of social justice, Sophia continues, involves political power and participation. What constitutes a just distribution of decision-making authority? Should political influence be distributed equally through democratic processes, proportional to stake or contribution, or according to expertise on specific issues? How do we balance majority rule with minority rights and individual liberties? The city's central square comes into view, filled with people engaged in various forms of political participation, voting, deliberating in public forums, engaging in peaceful protest, serving on citizens' councils. You notice that participation isn't equal. Some voices carry more weight than others through formal or informal mechanisms of influence. This raises questions about what true political equality would require in societies with diverse capabilities, interests, and historical power imbalances. These questions about political justice, Sophia observes, become particularly acute when societies face deep moral disagreements. Consider dilemmas around religious freedom versus non-discrimination. Should a business owner with religious objections to same-sex marriage be required to provide services for such weddings? Should religious schools receive public funding if they teach doctrines that some citizens find harmful or discriminatory? How do we balance religious liberty with equal protection under law? The city now reveals neighborhoods with different approaches to these tensions, some prioritizing broad religious exemptions, others enforcing uniform, non-discrimination rules, some creating context-specific compromises. Each approach realizes certain values while compromising others, demonstrating that plural societies inevitably face trade-offs between competing conceptions of justice when deep moral disagreements exist. What emerges from these dilemmas, Sophia suggests, is recognition that justice in diverse societies requires not just substantive principles, but fair processes for resolving disagreement. Procedural justice focuses on ensuring decisions are made through processes that treat all participants with equal respect and consideration, even when substantive agreement remains elusive. The path now leads to a complex structure that resembles both a forum and a bridge, a space designed for fair engagement across deep differences. Various chambers accommodate different modes of resolution: democratic voting, judicial review, mediation, deliberative dialogue, suggesting that different types of disputes might require different procedural approaches to achieve justice. This procedural dimension, Sophia explains, highlights a fundamental insight. Justice isn't just about reaching perfect outcomes, but about treating each person as having equal moral status in our social arrangements. Even when we cannot agree on all substantive questions, we can commit to processes that recognize everyone's dignity and voice. As you traverse this bridge-like forum, you notice how it's designed to enable participation regardless of power or privilege, with accessibility features, translation services, timing that accommodates different life circumstances, and protections against domination by the most powerful voices. These elements suggest that procedural fairness requires attention to how social and historical inequalities might distort even seemingly neutral processes. As we explore these dimensions of social justice, Sophia says, notice that they continuously interact with our earlier questions about the circle of moral concern. Justice looks different depending on whether we consider only current citizens, all humans globally, future generations, or non-human beings affected by our social arrangements. The boundaries of our moral community fundamentally shape what justice requires. The city now reveals its relationship to the wider landscape: ports connecting to distant communities, communication networks linking to global concerns, infrastructure designed with future generations in mind, and green spaces that accommodate non-human life. These connections represent how justice increasingly requires thinking beyond traditional boundaries of the nation-state to consider global and intergenerational dimensions. Similarly, Sophia continues, Questions of justice interact with our reflections on different ethical frameworks. Utilitarian approaches focus on arrangements that maximize overall welfare. Deontological perspectives emphasize rights that cannot be violated even for good outcomes. Virtue ethics asks what institutional arrangements cultivate the character needed for flourishing societies. Each approach illuminates different aspects of social justice. The path beneath your feet now incorporates elements from each of these frameworks: utilitarian considerations of welfare, deontological protections of rights, virtue-oriented institutions that develop civic character. This integrated path suggests that comprehensive theories of justice might draw insights from multiple ethical traditions, rather than relying exclusively on any single approach. What makes these questions of social justice more than abstract theorizing, Sophia observes, is their profound impact on human lives. The institutions we build together determine whether people can meet basic needs, develop their capabilities, participate as equals in collective decisions, and live with dignity. Justice matters not just as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality that shapes the quality and meaning of our existence together. The city around you pulses with this lived significance, faces showing the real effects of just and unjust arrangements, communities thriving or struggling based on the institutions that structure their interactions, individuals whose life possibilities are expanded or constrained by the opportunities and protections their society provides. These human realities ground abstract theories in concrete consequences that matter deeply. As we prepare to leave this city of justice, Sophia says, let's consider one final dilemma that brings together many threads of our exploration. Imagine a society facing resource constraints that limit its ability to meet all needs equally well. How should it prioritize between early childhood education, elder care, environmental protection, public safety, and basic scientific research? Each serves genuine human goods. None can be maximized without trade-offs against the others. The city center now displays a round table where representatives advocate for each of these priorities, making compelling cases based on different conceptions of justice: equal opportunity, care for the vulnerable, intergenerational responsibility, security, and progress. You sense that no perfect solution exists that would fully satisfy all legitimate claims, yet choices must be made that reflect some understanding of what justice prioritizes in conditions of scarcity. This dilemma, Sophia explains, reveals the inescapable nature of tragic choices in social life. Sometimes, all available options involve genuine moral loss, sacrificing some legitimate claims to honor others. In such situations, justice requires not just making the least bad choice, but acknowledging the loss, providing some compensation when possible, and continuing to work toward conditions where such tragic trade-offs become less necessary. The round table discussion now includes rituals of acknowledgement for the valid claims that cannot be fully met, along with ongoing efforts to expand resources and find innovative solutions that might eventually reconcile these competing priorities. This approach suggests that justice involves not just distribution under constraints, but sustained commitment to creating conditions where fuller realization of multiple values becomes possible. As we leave this city, Sophia concludes, carry with you an appreciation for both the complexity of justice and its fundamental importance. Just institutions provide the foundation upon which individual flourishing becomes possible, the soil in which the diverse flowers of human capability can bloom. Yet justice remains an unfinished project, requiring ongoing vigilance, creativity, and commitment as new challenges and insights emerge. The city of justice gradually recedes behind you as your path leads toward what appears to be a temple nestled in the mountainside ahead. This structure represents the next territory of moral exploration, where questions of integrity, obligation, and the foundations of ethics await your consideration. Your journey through moral dilemmas continues, each territory building upon and illuminating those that came before, creating an increasingly rich understanding of the ethical landscape that defines humanity. As you approach the temple, nestled in the mountainside, its ancient stones gleam with a soft inner light that seems to emanate from the material itself. Unlike the bustling complexity of the city you've left behind, this structure embodies a contemplative simplicity, clean lines, harmonious proportions, and an atmosphere of tranquil reflection. The entrance consists of a series of concentric archways, each inscribed with words in different languages that all translate to concepts of integrity, authenticity, and moral consistency. "Here," Sophia says, her voice taking on the reverent quality that the space seems to demand, "we enter the domain of personal integrity and moral consistency, the realm where we confront questions not just about isolated actions, but about the coherence of our moral lives. What does it mean to live with integrity? How do we maintain moral wholeness when different values and obligations pull us in conflicting directions? What happens when being true to our commitments requires significant personal sacrifice?" As you pass through the archways and enter the temple's interior, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed yet again. Now they appear embedded in a mosaic floor that depicts a human figure whose body contains many different elements: reason and emotion, personal desires and social bonds, professional roles and private commitments, all somehow integrated into a coherent whole rather than fragmented or compartmentalized. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine you hold a professional position that sometimes requires actions in tension with your personal moral convictions. Perhaps you're a lawyer defending clients you believe are guilty, a soldier ordered to participate in a mission you consider unjust, or a business executive implementing policies that conflict with your values. What does integrity require in such situations? Should you compartmentalize your professional and personal morality? Resign your position? Try to change the institution from within? Each approach involves different conceptions of moral wholeness. The mosaic floor shifts to illustrate these alternatives, first showing fragmentation between professional and personal selves, then a singular self stepping away from institutional roles that compromise its values. Finally, a self engaged in the complex work of reforming flawed institutions while navigating their existing constraints. Each image captures genuine aspects of integrity, yet none appears to offer a perfect resolution to the tension between role obligations and personal moral commitments. This tension, Sophia explains, reveals how moral integrity involves both standing firm on core values and navigating complex social realities. The word integrity comes from the Latin integer, meaning whole or complete. It suggests an undivided moral self, someone whose actions align with their deepest values across different contexts. Yet, we inhabit many roles with distinct expectations and responsibilities. Complete moral purity might require withdrawal from important social functions, while uncritical acceptance of role obligations can compromise our deepest values. The temple's walls now display a series of portraits, individuals who have faced this dilemma in different contexts and responded in various ways. Some show whistleblowers who sacrificed career and security to expose wrongdoing. Others depict reformers who worked within imperfect systems to gradually align them with justice. Still others show individuals who developed nuanced approaches to role morality that neither completely separate professional ethics from personal values, nor simply collapse the distinction between them. What these diverse responses suggest, Sophia observes, is that integrity might be better understood as an ongoing process of moral integration rather than a static state of perfect consistency. It involves constantly working to bring our various commitments, roles, and values into greater alignment, sometimes by changing our circumstances, sometimes by clarifying our values, sometimes by developing more nuanced understandings of our responsibilities in complex situations. The mosaic floor now depicts this dynamic process, showing the human figure engaged in continuous internal dialogue and discernment, adjusting both actions and understanding to achieve greater coherence between diverse elements of moral life. This image suggests integrity as an active practice rather than a passive state, a verb more than a noun. Another dimension of integrity, Sophia continues, involves fidelity to commitments over time, especially when keeping those commitments becomes difficult or costly. Consider the dilemma of whether to keep a significant promise when circumstances have changed in ways that make fulfillment much more burdensome than you anticipated. Perhaps you promised to care for someone through illness, not realizing how lengthy and demanding that care would become. Or you committed to a project that now requires sacrifices you didn't foresee. What does integrity require when keeping your word comes at substantial personal cost? The temple's architecture now reveals a series of chambers connected by corridors that symbolize the passage of time. In the first chamber, you see representations of promises and commitments being made. Subsequent chambers show these same commitments being tested by changing circumstances, unexpected difficulties, competing obligations, personal costs higher than anticipated. The final chamber shows different responses to these tests, some maintaining the original commitment despite the cost, others renegotiating terms while honoring the underlying relationship, still others recognizing when a commitment has become impossible to fulfill in its original form. This temporal dimension of integrity, Sophia explains, highlights the tension between moral consistency and appropriate responsiveness to changing circumstances. The person of integrity isn't rigidly bound to past commitments regardless of consequences, but neither do they casually discard obligations when they become inconvenient. Integrity involves discernment about when fidelity requires maintaining commitments despite difficulty, when it permits renegotiation in changed circumstances, and when it might even mandate breaking a promise that has become destructive to maintain. The corridors connecting the chambers now display various approaches to managing this tension, practices of discernment that help distinguish between legitimate adaptation to new information and mere rationalization of convenience, processes for honorable renegotiation that respect the expectations created by initial commitments, and ways of addressing the moral residue that often accompanies even justified changes to our promises and obligations. What complicates these questions further, Sophia notes, is that we often face conflicting commitments rather than simple choices between keeping or breaking a single obligation. Imagine a healthcare worker during a pandemic who has commitments both to patients who need care and to protecting their own family from potential infection. Or consider parents balancing obligations to their children with responsibilities to aging parents who require assistance. When all commitments cannot be perfectly fulfilled, what does integrity require? The temple now opens onto a courtyard where multiple paths intersect and sometimes conflict, representing these competing obligations that cannot all be followed simultaneously. Unlike earlier dilemmas where different values competed, here the paths represent commitments to different people or principles, all of which have legitimate moral claims on your fidelity. In such situations, Sophia suggests, integrity might require not finding the one right path, for there may be none that perfectly honors all legitimate commitments, but approaching these conflicts with appropriate moral attitudes. These include honest acknowledgement of the competing claims, serious effort to minimize harm to all relationships involved, willingness to accept moral residue rather than pretending no wrong was done, and commitment to repairing damaged relationships when possible. The courtyard now shows figures navigating these intersecting paths with precisely such attitudes, engaging in difficult conversations with those affected by their choices, making genuine efforts to honor the spirit of commitments even when the letter cannot be fully maintained, acknowledging rather than denying the moral costs of their decisions, and working to heal relationships strained by competing obligations. Another crucial aspect of integrity, Sophia continues, concerns authenticity and moral identity. Consider dilemmas where being true to your core values or identity might carry significant social costs. Perhaps expressing your genuine religious or political convictions would alienate family members, damage your career prospects, or even put your safety at risk in certain contexts. What does integrity require when authenticity comes at a high personal price? The temple's interior transforms to reveal a series of reflective surfaces, not ordinary mirrors, but deeper pools of reflection that seem to show not just your external appearance, but something of your essential nature and core values. Between these pools of self-knowledge stand various masks and costumes representing the social personas you might adopt for protection, advancement, or acceptance in different contexts. This tension between authenticity and prudence, Sophia explains, has no universal resolution. Sometimes integrity clearly requires expressing core values despite social costs, standing up against injustice even when doing so brings criticism or exclusion. Other times, prudent silence or selective disclosure might better serve both self-preservation and long-term moral effectiveness. The person of integrity navigates this terrain not with rigid rules, but with attention to both the importance of authenticity and the legitimate claims of prudence in hostile environments. The reflective pools and masks now exist in a more integrated relationship, suggesting that integrity involves neither absolute transparency, regardless of consequences, nor complete conformity to external expectations, but thoughtful discernment about when, where, and how to express one's authentic moral identity in a complex social world. What makes these questions of integrity more than abstract philosophical puzzles, Sophia observes, is their connection to our sense of moral wholeness and self-respect. When we compromise integrity, whether by compartmentalizing our moral lives, casually breaking commitments, or habitually suppressing our authentic values, we often experience not just external consequences, but internal fragmentation. We lose the sense of moral wholeness that integrity provides. The mosaic floor now shows contrasting images, one depicting internal harmony where actions align with values and commitments across contexts, another showing the fragmentation that occurs when different aspects of moral life become disconnected or contradictory. These images suggest that integrity matters not just for its external manifestations, but for the internal experience of moral coherence that contributes to human flourishing. At the same time, Sophia notes, perfect integrity may remain an aspiration rather than a fully achievable reality in our complex moral lives. We inhabit multiple roles with distinct responsibilities, make commitments under conditions of uncertainty, and live in social contexts that sometimes penalize authentic expression of certain values. Integrity involves working toward greater moral coherence while acknowledging these complexities rather than pretending they don't exist. The temple's central chamber now reveals a contemplative space with a small, steady flame burning at its center, representing the ongoing work of moral integration that continues throughout life. Around this flame are arrayed symbols of different aspects of moral life, roles and relationships, commitments and values, public and private dimensions of selfhood, all oriented toward this central work of creating and maintaining moral wholeness. As we prepare to leave this temple, Sophia says, consider one final dilemma that brings together these dimensions of integrity. Imagine someone who has built their personal and professional identity around a particular moral or religious tradition, only to experience serious doubts about its validity later in life. The tradition has shaped their core values, important relationships, and understanding of purpose. Abandoning it would mean reconstructing their moral identity from the ground up, possibly damaging important relationships and communities. Maintaining commitment despite doubt might preserve these goods, but at the cost of intellectual honesty. What does integrity require in such a crisis of faith or moral conviction? The temple's exit path now shows different responses to this profound challenge. Some figures finding ways to honestly reconstruct their moral frameworks while maintaining connections to valuable traditions and communities. Others making clean breaks despite the costs when integrity demands it. Still others discovering ways to honor their doubts within evolving but continuous relationships to their traditions. No single path appears universally right, but each represents a thoughtful engagement with the demands of integrity in moments of deep moral transition. This dilemma, Sophia explains, reveals how integrity sometimes requires not rigid consistency, but honest evolution of our moral understanding. The person of integrity doesn't deny genuine doubt or cling to convictions they can no longer authentically affirm. Yet neither do they casually discard formative traditions without serious reflection on what remains valuable within them. Integrity in such transitions involves both intellectual honesty about changing convictions and fidelity to the ongoing project of building a coherent moral identity. As you prepare to exit the temple, you notice that the light illuminating its interior doesn't come from a single source, but emerges from the integration of many smaller lights. Just as moral integrity doesn't derive from a single principle, but from the coherent integration of our various values, commitments, and relationships into a meaningful whole. This distributed yet harmonious illumination creates both clarity and gentle shadows, suggesting that integrity involves both moral conviction and humble recognition of complexity. As we leave this temple, Sophia concludes, carry with you an appreciation for integrity's fundamental importance in moral life. While specific ethical dilemmas focus on what we should do in particular situations, integrity concerns who we are across situations, the coherence and continuity that make our moral lives meaningful rather than fragmented or compartmentalized. This quest for moral wholeness remains one of humanity's defining challenges. never perfectly achieved, yet always worthy of our ongoing commitment. The temple of integrity gradually recedes behind you as your path leads toward what appears to be a crossroads in a mist-shrouded valley below. This intersection represents the next territory of moral exploration, where questions of moral luck, responsibility, and the role of intention versus outcome await your consideration. Your journey through moral dilemmas continues, each territory adding depth and nuance to your understanding of the ethical landscape that defines humanity. As you descend from the temple into the mist-shrouded valley, the path gradually reveals a complex intersection where multiple routes converge and diverge. Unlike ordinary crossroads where travelers consciously choose their direction, this junction has peculiar qualities. Some paths appear only momentarily before vanishing, others seem to shift under the influence of wind and weather, and still others divide unexpectedly after travelers have already committed to them. The entire area is bathed in a diffuse light that makes it difficult to see far ahead on any route, though occasional clearings in the mist offer glimpses of possible destinations. "We have arrived," Sophia says, her voice mingling with the soft sounds of the mist. "At the crossroads of fortune, the realm where we confront questions about the role of luck, chance, and circumstances beyond our control in moral life. What responsibility do we bear for outcomes shaped by factors we didn't choose? How should we judge actions with unforeseen consequences? What moral significance should we attach to the talents, opportunities, and limitations we're born with or encounter through no choice of our own?" These questions cut to the heart of how we understand moral responsibility in a world permeated by contingency. As you stand at this mysterious intersection, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed once more. Now they appear as balanced but unstable, responsive not just to conscious choices, but to gusts of wind, shifting ground, and other unpredictable factors. This representation suggests the complex interplay between intentional action and circumstantial influence that characterizes human moral experience. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine two equally reckless drivers who both run red lights. One passes through safely, merely breaking traffic laws. The other strikes a pedestrian who unexpectedly stepped into the crosswalk, causing serious injury or death. Both made the same moral choice, but one faces far more serious consequences and, in most legal systems, much more severe punishment. Is the difference in how we judge and respond to these drivers morally justified, given that the different outcomes resulted from factors beyond their control? The misty crossroads parts momentarily to show these parallel scenarios. Identical decisions leading to dramatically different outcomes based on the sheer contingency of whether a pedestrian happened to be present. You feel the intuitive pull to judge the driver who caused harm more harshly, yet also recognize the philosophical puzzle this creates about the role of luck in moral evaluation. This scenario, Sophia explains, illustrates what philosophers call resultant moral luck, where the moral assessment of an action depends partly on outcomes determined by factors beyond the agent's control. Our practical moral judgments often assign great importance to actual results rather than focusing exclusively on intentions or risk-taking. The driver who kills faces criminal charges, moral condemnation, and their own guilt in ways the lucky driver entirely escapes, despite identical moral choices. The scales beneath your feet tip dramatically when result-based weights are added, then rebalance when only intention-based factors are considered. This visualization represents the tension between outcome-focused and intent-focused approaches to moral evaluation, both capturing important aspects of our moral intuitions, yet leading to different judgments when luck plays a significant role in determining results. Resultant luck is just one form this phenomenon takes, Sophia continues. Consider circumstantial moral luck, where the situations we happen to face shape our moral possibilities and challenges. Imagine two people with identical moral characters, one living in a peaceful, prosperous society, the other in a violent, authoritarian regime where moral compromises may be necessary for survival. Or consider two people with the same latent weaknesses, but only one faces temptations that reveal these flaws. Do these circumstantial differences affect the moral evaluation we should make of these individuals? The misty intersection now reveals parallel lives shaped by different circumstances. Some paths offering easy moral clarity with minimal personal cost, others forcing difficult choices between competing values or requiring significant sacrifice to maintain moral integrity. These divergent routes suggest how profoundly our moral possibilities are shaped by situations we don't choose. This form of moral luck, Sophia observes, challenges the intuition that moral worth should depend only on factors within our control. We praise the courage of those who resist oppression or protect others at personal risk. Yet such virtues cannot be demonstrated without the circumstantial bad luck of facing threatening situations. We sometimes judge those who collaborate with injustice harshly, yet we cannot know with certainty how we ourselves would act under similar pressures without having faced them. The crossroads shifts again to reveal multiple versions of yourself traversing different possible life paths. Some facing moral challenges you've been spared in your actual life. Others enjoying easier moral terrain than you've had to navigate. This visualization invites humility in moral judgment, recognition that your own moral character exists in constant interaction with circumstances you didn't choose. Even more fundamental, Sophia continues, is what philosophers call constitutive moral luck. The fact that we don't choose our natural temperaments, capacities, or early formative influences. Some people are born with dispositions that make virtues like patience or courage come more easily. Others receive moral education and modeling that shape their character before they develop the capacity for autonomous moral reflection. How should these unchosen factors affect our understanding of moral responsibility and desert? The mist parts to reveal the origins of the many paths, some beginning in fertile soil with clear guidance markers, others in rocky terrain with confusing or missing signage. These different starting conditions represent the varied moral resources and challenges people receive through genetic inheritance, early upbringing, cultural context, and other unchosen factors that profoundly influence moral development. This form of luck, Sophia explains, raises profound questions about moral desert and responsibility. To what extent can we take credit for virtues that come naturally to us, or blame others for failing to develop qualities they find inherently more difficult? How do we balance recognition of these unchosen factors with commitment to moral agency and accountability? Different philosophical and religious traditions have approached these questions in diverse ways. The Crossroads now displays figures representing various approaches to this dilemma, some emphasizing the reality of moral freedom despite unchosen constraints, others acknowledging the profound influence of nature and nurture on character, while focusing on present choices rather than ultimate desert. Still others suggesting that genuine moral responsibility might require rethinking in light of these unchosen influences. What complicates these questions further, Sophia notes, is the role of luck in our knowledge and foresight. Often, we make decisions without full awareness of relevant facts or potential consequences, not through negligence, but through the inevitable limitations of human knowledge. How should we evaluate actions that produce harm the agent could not reasonably have foreseen? When does ignorance excuse, and when does it merely explain moral failure? The mist thickens around certain paths, representing this epistemic dimension of moral luck. The fact that we often act with limited information about circumstances and consequences, making moral navigation inherently uncertain. Some paths that appeared promising when chosen lead to unexpected moral pitfalls, while others reveal fortunate opportunities that couldn't have been anticipated. Consider a concrete example of this epistemic dimension, Sophia suggests. Imagine a person who recommends a job candidate who later commits workplace harassment. The recommender knew nothing of this propensity and saw only professional qualifications. Are they partly responsible for the resulting harm because their recommendation created the opportunity? Or does their lack of knowledge absolve them of moral responsibility? What if they could have learned about past problematic behavior through more thorough investigation? Does that change the moral evaluation? The crossroads briefly clears to show this scenario. The complex causal chain from recommendation to harm, the limited perspective of the decision maker at the critical moment, the question of how much investigation duty requires before responsibility shifts. This example highlights how moral evaluation must navigate the reality of limited foresight in a complex world. These various forms of moral luck, Sophia observes, create a tension between two powerful intuitions: that moral responsibility should be limited to factors within our control, and that outcomes, circumstances, and constitutive factors beyond our control nevertheless matter morally. Most philosophical attempts to resolve this tension involve either limiting the scope of legitimate moral judgment to avoid luck-influenced assessments, or expanding our understanding of responsibility to acknowledge how deeply luck permeates moral life. The scales beneath your feet now incorporate both stable elements representing choice and intention, and dynamic elements responsive to chance and circumstance. This integrated representation suggests that comprehensive moral understanding might require acknowledging both the reality of moral agency and the pervasive influence of unchosen factors, rather than insisting one must entirely displace the other. What makes these questions about moral luck more than abstract puzzles, Sophia suggests, is their profound practical significance for how we judge ourselves and others. A moral framework that ignores luck might maintain philosophical purity, but fail to engage with the lived reality of human moral experience. Conversely, overemphasizing luck's role might undermine the moral accountability necessary for social cooperation. Wisdom involves finding a balance that acknowledges luck's reality while preserving meaningful moral responsibility. The crossroads now shows various approaches to this balance in practice. Legal systems that distinguish between attempted and completed crimes while still punishing unsuccessful attempts. Social practices that hold people accountable for outcomes while mitigating judgment based on intentions and constraints. Personal habits of moral reflection that acknowledge both agency and its limitations. These practices suggest how human societies navigate the reality of moral luck without abandoning the concept of responsibility. Another crucial implication of moral luck, Sophia continues, concerns how we respond to good and bad fortune more broadly. If much of what shapes our lives, talents, opportunities, obstacles, comes to us through no merit or fault of our own, what obligations do the fortunate have toward the less fortunate? Does the element of luck in human achievement justify greater redistribution of resources? Or does the reality of moral agency still justify significant inequalities based on different choices, even if those choices themselves are partly shaped by unchosen factors? As you approach the clearing in the forest, the arrangement of mirrors comes into clearer view. Unlike ordinary looking glasses, these reflective surfaces have unusual properties. Some magnify certain features while minimizing others. Some show not just your current self, but past or possible future versions. Others reveal aspects normally hidden from conscious awareness. The mirrors stand at various angles to each other, creating complex reflections that capture different perspectives simultaneously. Surrounding them grows a garden of plants known for their mind-altering properties in various traditions. Lotus flowers, poppies, certain mushrooms, and herbs used in ritual practices, suggesting this is a place where perception and reality maintain a complex relationship. Here, Sophia says, her voice taking on melodic qualities that seem to echo slightly among the mirrors, we enter the domain of moral psychology and self-knowledge, the realm where we confront questions about our awareness of our own motives, our capacity for self-deception, and the role of emotions in moral life. How well do we really know our own reasons for action? What happens when our moral self-image conflicts with our actual behavior? How do emotions like empathy, disgust, shame, and pride shape our moral perceptions and choices? These questions invite us to examine not just what we should do, but how the architecture of human psychology influences our moral lives. As you step among the mirrors, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed yet again. Now they appear almost transparent, revealing inner workings typically hidden from view. Springs representing motivational forces, weights that shift position depending on your angle of vision, counterbalances that sometimes operate outside conscious awareness. This complex mechanism suggests the often hidden psychological processes that influence moral judgment and decision-making. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine you're part of a community facing a controversial decision, perhaps about whether to welcome refugees, implement an affirmative action policy, or allow development in an environmentally sensitive area. You've taken a strong moral position based on principles you sincerely believe are just. Yet, psychological research suggests that many of our moral judgments are influenced by factors we don't acknowledge or may not even be aware of. Group loyalties, disgust responses, self-interest disguised as principle, status concerns, and so on. How should you relate to your own moral convictions, knowing they may be shaped by these unconscious influences? The mirrors around you shift to display this scenario, showing both your consciously held moral principles and, in dimmer reflection, the potential hidden influences shaping them. Some mirrors highlight how your position aligns with your group identity. Others reveal emotional reactions that preceded your rational justifications. Still others show how your stance might serve interests you haven't explicitly acknowledged. These reflections don't necessarily invalidate your position, but complicate the purity of your moral self-understanding. This scenario, Sophia explains, highlights what philosophers and psychologists call motivated reasoning, our tendency to unconsciously select and interpret evidence in ways that support conclusions we already prefer for other reasons. We experience ourselves as impartially weighing facts and principles. But research suggests we often start with intuitive judgments, influenced by emotions and social allegiances, then construct rational justifications afterward. This doesn't mean our moral positions lack validity, but it does challenge the transparency we assume in our own moral reasoning. The mirrors now demonstrate this process, showing how moral conclusions often form quickly through intuitive processes, followed by more deliberate reasoning that selectively emphasizes facts and principles, supporting the intuitive judgment while minimizing countervailing considerations. This reflection suggests how our experience of moral clarity may sometimes mask more complex psychological processes beneath the surface of awareness. What makes this particularly challenging, Sophia continues, is that we typically notice motivated reasoning more easily in others than in ourselves. When someone disagrees with our moral position, we readily perceive how their reasoning might be influenced by group loyalty, self-interest, or emotional reactions. Yet, we experience our own reasoning as driven primarily by an impartial concern for truth and justice. This asymmetry creates a kind of moral blindness that can make genuine dialogue across differences extraordinarily difficult. The mirrors now arrange themselves to demonstrate this asymmetry, showing greater transparency when reflecting others' potential biases than when displaying your own, revealing how easily we can perceive the psychological underpinnings of opposing viewpoints while maintaining the illusion of pure rationality in our own. This arrangement suggests how psychological realities can create barriers to mutual understanding, even when we sincerely believe we're engaged in good faith moral dialogue. This challenge of moral psychology, Sophia observes, doesn't invalidate the possibility of moral knowledge or reasoned ethical discourse, but it does suggest that moral growth requires developing greater awareness of our own psychological processes, learning to recognize when our reasoning might be motivated by factors other than impartial assessment of relevant moral considerations. This self-awareness doesn't eliminate these influences, but can help us compensate for them more effectively. The mirrors shift again to show practices that might cultivate this self-awareness. Habits of actively seeking contrary evidence, engaging empathetically with opposing perspectives, examining the origins of strong emotional reactions to moral issues, and considering how your positions might look different if your social location or interests were different. These reflective practices don't promise perfect self-knowledge, but offer paths toward more honest moral understanding. Another crucial dimension of moral psychology, Sophia continues, involves self-deception about our own behavior. Consider situations where people maintain a moral self-image that contradicts their actions. The business executive who sees himself as ethical despite cutting corners, the activist who ignores problematic behavior within his movement while condemning it in opponents, or the person who considers herself generous but consistently prioritizes personal comfort over others' needs. How do we manage these contradictions between who we believe ourselves to be and how we actually behave? The mirrors now display this phenomenon, showing figures who maintain positive moral self-perceptions while simultaneously engaging in behaviors that contradict these self-images. The reflections reveal the various psychological mechanisms that enable this contradiction: selective attention to evidence, reframing of actions to emphasize positive aspects, advantageous comparisons with others perceived as worse, and displacement of responsibility onto circumstances or systems rather than personal choice. This capacity for self-deception, Sophia explains, creates a particular moral challenge. When we deceive others, we typically know we're doing so, but self-deception operates partly outside awareness. We genuinely believe our self-justifications, even as something in us knows they're incomplete or misleading. This paradoxical state makes self-deception especially difficult to address, as confronting it threatens not just our actions, but our fundamental sense of who we are as moral beings. The mirrors demonstrate this paradox, showing how self-deception exists in a liminal space between knowing and not knowing, how we can simultaneously maintain a positive moral self-image and behave in ways that contradict it, neither fully conscious of the contradiction nor completely unaware of it. This complex reflection suggests the psychological flexibility that allows humans to navigate moral inconsistencies without intolerable levels of dissonance. What complicates these questions further, Sophia notes, is the role of emotions in moral life. Consider how emotions like empathy, disgust, shame, pride, guilt, and indignation shape our moral perceptions and judgments. Are these emotions reliable guides to moral truth, offering intuitive wisdom accumulated through evolution and experience? Or are they potential sources of bias that should be constrained by rational principles? Different philosophical traditions have taken dramatically different positions on this relationship between emotion and moral understanding. The mirrors now display various emotional responses to moral situations, showing how empathy can connect us to others' suffering, how disgust can signal moral boundaries, how indignation can motivate resistance to injustice, but also how these same emotions can sometimes mislead, focusing our attention selectively or generating responses disproportionate to moral reality. These reflections suggest both the wisdom and the limitations of emotional responses in moral life. The Enlightenment tradition, Sophia explains, often portrayed emotions as potential corruptions of moral reasoning, biases to be controlled by rational principles. Kant, for instance, argued that actions motivated by emotion, even compassion, lack true moral worth, which comes only from acting from duty recognized through reason. By contrast, philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith saw moral sentiments as the very foundation of ethics, with reason serving primarily to inform and regulate these sentiments rather than replace them. The mirrors arrange themselves to display these contrasting perspectives, one showing reason as the proper guide with emotions as potential distortions, another showing emotions as the essential foundation with reason as an important but secondary refinement. Each reflection captures something important about the relationship between reason and emotion in moral life, suggesting that comprehensive understanding might require integrating insights from both approaches. Contemporary cognitive science, Sophia continues, suggests a more integrated view, that reasoning and emotion work together in moral judgment, each contributing essential elements and constraining the other's potential excesses. Emotions without rational reflection can lead us astray through their selectivity and intensity. Reasoning without emotional engagement can fail to register morally significant aspects of situations that don't fit neatly into abstract principles. Wisdom might involve developing both emotional intelligence and rational clarity, allowing them to inform and check each other. The mirrors now show a more complex, integrated reflection, rational processes and emotional responses working in dynamic relationship, sometimes in tension, but ideally in productive dialogue. This integration suggests a more sophisticated moral psychology that acknowledges the contributions and limitations of both faculties rather than privileging either exclusively. What makes these questions of moral psychology more than abstract curiosities, Sophia observes, is their profound practical importance for ethical development. If we want to become better people, more consistent, more sensitive to moral reality, more reliable in acting according to our deepest values, we need accurate understanding of how our minds actually work. Idealized models that ignore psychological realities may offer appealing simplicity, but provide limited practical guidance for moral growth. The mirrors briefly clear to show various practices of moral development across traditions, contemplative disciplines that cultivate awareness of mental processes, communal practices that provide external perspective on our blind spots, emotional exercises that develop more nuanced, effective responses to moral situations, and intellectual habits that help reason and emotion work in better coordination. These diverse approaches suggest how different wisdom traditions have developed practical methods for addressing the challenges of moral psychology. Particularly fascinating, Sophia notes, are cross-cultural differences in moral psychology. Research suggests that cultures vary in which emotions figure most prominently in moral life, some emphasizing empathy and harm, others giving greater weight to purity and sanctity, still others focusing on loyalty and respect. These differences remind us that moral psychology doesn't operate in a cultural vacuum, but develops within specific social contexts that shape which aspects of situations become morally salient and which emotions are activated by moral concerns. The mirrors now display moral reactions to similar situations across different cultural contexts, showing how the same action might activate different emotions and considerations depending on cultural background, how moral attention focuses on different aspects of the same situation in different traditions, how the boundaries of moral concern vary across societies. These diverse reflections suggest the complex interaction between universal aspects of moral psychology and culturally variable expressions. As we navigate these questions of moral psychology, Sophia suggests, we might find wisdom in approaches that neither idealize human moral capacities nor surrender to cynicism about their limitations. Perhaps moral development involves working with our actual psychological processes, not pretending we can transcend them entirely, but gradually refining them through practices that increase self-awareness, develop more nuanced emotional responses, and build habits of more comprehensive moral reasoning. The path through the mirrors now appears as an ongoing journey of increasing self-knowledge, not a straight line toward perfect moral clarity, but a spiral that revisits similar challenges with gradually deepening understanding. This pattern suggests that moral wisdom involves not transcending psychological realities, but working skillfully with them, acknowledging their influence while developing greater freedom within their constraints. As we prepare to leave these mirrors, Sophia says, consider one final dilemma that brings together these aspects of moral psychology. Imagine someone gradually recognizing patterns in their own behavior that contradict their moral self-image, perhaps noticing they consistently favor their own interests while believing themselves altruistic, or discovering they harbor biases they consciously reject, or realizing their stated values rarely translate into corresponding actions when personal cost is involved. What would genuine moral growth look like in response to such recognition? How might they work constructively with these insights rather than either denying them or being paralyzed by them. The mirrors reveal different responses to this moment of moral self-recognition, some showing denial or defensive rationalization that preserves self-image at the cost of growth, others displaying excessive shame that undermines the agency needed for positive change, still others demonstrating more constructive approaches that acknowledge limitations without surrendering the possibility of improvement. These reflections suggest different possible trajectories when we confront contradictions between our moral ideals and psychological realities. This dilemma, Sophia explains, points toward a nuanced understanding of moral development, one that maintains aspirational ideals while acknowledging psychological limitations, that cultivates self-awareness without indulging in paralyzing self-criticism, that balances appropriate moral ambition with humble recognition of our embeddedness in psychological and social processes that shape our perceptions and choices. Such understanding might help us navigate not just abstract philosophical questions, but the lived reality of trying to become better people in a complex psychological landscape. As you prepare to leave the clearing of mirrors, you notice that they don't simply show static reflections, but reveal processes unfolding over time, how moral understanding develops, how awareness gradually illuminates previously hidden aspects of motivation, how emotional responses become more nuanced through experience. These dynamic reflections suggest that moral psychology isn't fixed, but capable of development through intentional practice and honest self-examination. As we leave these mirrors, Sophia concludes, carry with you an appreciation for the complex psychological realities that underlie moral experience. Rather than seeing these realities as obstacles to overcome, we might understand them as the very material with which moral wisdom works, neither denying their influence nor surrendering to it, but gradually cultivating greater awareness and skill in navigating the psychological dimensions of ethical life. The arrangement of mirrors gradually recedes behind you as your path leads toward what appears to be a village visible through the trees ahead. This human settlement represents the next territory of moral exploration, where questions of conflicting duties, tragic dilemmas, and moral compromise await your consideration. Your journey through moral dilemmas continues, each territory adding depth and nuance to your understanding of the ethical landscape that defines humanity. As you emerge from the forest, a small village comes into view, nestled in a valley between gentle hills. Unlike the grand city of justice with its imposing institutions, this settlement has a more intimate scale. Homes where families live in close proximity, a marketplace where neighbors exchange goods and information, workshops where craftspeople practice traditional skills, gardens where food is grown for local consumption. Yet despite its apparent simplicity, the village pulses with moral complexity. As you draw closer, you notice people navigating intricate webs of relationships and responsibilities, often visibly torn between competing claims on their time, attention, and loyalty. "We have arrived," Sophia says, her voice taking on the warm but sometimes strained tones of close community. "At the village of competing obligations, the realm where we confront questions about conflicts between legitimate moral duties, tragic choices where all available options involve some moral loss, and the nature of moral compromise. What should we do when fulfilling one important obligation requires neglecting another? How do we navigate situations where every possible choice involves some wrongdoing? When, if ever, is moral compromise justified for the sake of other values?" These questions arise most powerfully in the concrete contexts of everyday life among others who have legitimate claims on us. As you walk the village paths with Sophia, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed once more. Now they appear as a complex mobile with multiple balance points, some elements rising as others fall, some weights directly opposing others, the entire structure requiring constant small adjustments to maintain any semblance of equilibrium. This representation suggests the dynamic balance required to navigate multiple obligations that cannot all be perfectly fulfilled simultaneously. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine a healthcare worker during a crisis like a pandemic. They have professional obligations to care for patients, often working extra shifts in dangerous conditions. Yet they also have obligations to their family, to protect them from potential infection, to be present for children struggling with disrupted routines, to support a partner bearing additional household responsibilities. When these obligations conflict, as they inevitably will during extended crises, how should they navigate these competing moral claims? The village scene shifts to show this scenario. A medical professional returning home, exhausted after caring for suffering patients, removing protective gear at the doorway, maintaining physical distance from family members who clearly need emotional support, trying to be present for children while processing their own trauma and fear. You feel the weight of these irreconcilable pulls, the duty to vulnerable patients, and the obligations to equally vulnerable family members. This scenario, Sophia explains, illustrates what philosophers sometimes call moral overload, situations where we face multiple obligations that cannot all be satisfied under the circumstances. Unlike simpler moral problems where the challenge is determining the right course of action, these dilemmas involve genuine moral loss. Whatever we choose, some legitimate value will be compromised or obligation left unfulfilled. The question becomes not how to avoid moral costs entirely, but how to navigate them with integrity. The mobile beneath your feet shifts to demonstrate this concept. Multiple weights representing different obligations, all legitimate, yet impossible to perfectly balance simultaneously under the constraints of limited time, energy, and sometimes conflicting requirements. This visualization suggests that moral perfection may be unattainable in such situations, not because of personal failing, but because of the structure of the dilemma itself. Different ethical frameworks, Sophia continues, approach such conflicts in different ways. Utilitarian approaches suggest we should simply calculate which action produces the greatest good overall. Perhaps the healthcare worker should prioritize whichever role saves more lives or prevents more suffering in total. Deontological perspectives often try to establish a hierarchy of duties. Perhaps professional obligations take precedence in this context because they were explicitly undertaken and affect more people. Virtue ethics might ask what response best expresses the virtues appropriate to both professional and family roles in these challenging circumstances. The village now reveals people navigating this dilemma through different approaches, some making explicit calculations of comparative good, others referring to established principles about duty hierarchies, still others seeking responses that maintain virtues like compassion, responsibility, and integrity across their conflicting obligations. Each approach offers valuable insights, yet none completely eliminates the moral tension inherent in the situation. What complicates these conflicts further, Sophia notes, is that they often involve incommensurable values, goods that cannot be reduced to a common measure for straightforward comparison. How do we weigh professional obligations to strangers against intimate duties to family? How do we compare the acute suffering of patients against the developmental needs of children? These aren't just differences in degree, but in kind, making simple utilitarian calculations problematic. The village marketplace now comes into view, with merchants and customers exchanging different goods: fruits, textiles, pottery, tools, each valuable in its own way, but not directly comparable through any single measure of worth. This metaphor suggests how moral values and obligations might similarly resist reduction to a common currency, requiring more nuanced forms of practical reasoning that acknowledge their qualitative differences. In the face of such complexity, Sophia observes, philosophical approaches that recognize the plurality and potential conflict of values may offer more practical wisdom than those seeking a single principle or decision procedure. Isaiah Berlin spoke of value pluralism, the view that human goods are genuinely diverse and sometimes irreconcilable, not merely apparent conflicts resolvable through better theory. This perspective suggests that moral dilemmas involving competing obligations may sometimes be tragic, in the sense that they necessitate genuine moral loss, whatever option we choose. The village elder's house comes into view, a simple but dignified structure where difficult community decisions are addressed. Inside, you glimpse deliberations that acknowledge both the necessity of choice and the reality of moral remainder, the obligations left unfulfilled, the legitimate claims unmet, the values compromised even by the best available option. This approach suggests a moral maturity that faces difficult choices without pretending they can be made costless through clever theory. This recognition of tragic structure, Sophia explains, doesn't imply moral nihilism or surrender to arbitrary choice. Rather, it calls for practical wisdom that acknowledges complexity while still seeking the best available path. We can identify better and worse responses to competing obligations, even if no response perfectly satisfies all legitimate claims. The healthcare worker might develop creative compromises, using technology to maintain family connection while physically absent, creating clear boundaries around some protected family time, finding ways to process stress that don't burden either patients or family. The village now shows people navigating competing obligations through just such creative approaches, not eliminating the underlying tension, but finding ways to partially honor multiple commitments, to distribute inevitable compromises thoughtfully rather than sacrificing some values entirely for others, to acknowledge moral costs without being paralyzed by them. These responses suggest practical wisdom that works within the constraints of moral complexity rather than denying it. Beyond specific cases, Sophia continues, competing obligations raise broader questions about the structure of moral life. Should we try to minimize such conflicts through careful life planning, avoiding roles or commitments likely to generate competing claims? Or should we accept them as inevitable aspects of a rich human life embedded in multiple relationships and communities? Different philosophical and religious traditions have approached this structural question in different ways. The village reveals contrasting lifestyles. Some residents demonstrating focused commitment to fewer, carefully harmonized obligations. Others embedded in complex webs of relationship that regularly generate competing claims. Still others moving between these approaches in different life stages. These diverse patterns suggest that both simplified and complex moral ecologies offer distinctive goods and challenges, with neither clearly superior in all contexts, particularly challenging Sophia notes, are situations where all available options involve some direct moral wrongdoing, not just failing to fulfill some obligations, but actively violating important moral principles. These dirty hands problems arise especially in institutional and political contexts, where leaders must sometimes choose between options, all of which involve moral transgression. Consider a political leader who must decide whether to negotiate with a terrorist group that has taken hostages. Refusing negotiation may result in innocent deaths. Engaging in negotiation may encourage future terrorism. Either choice involves potential complicity in grave harm. The village council hall appears before you, where leaders grapple with just such dilemmas, weighing options, all of which involve potential moral transgression, trying to determine which violation is lesser or more necessary under the circumstances, considering not just immediate outcomes, but precedents set and future consequences. These deliberations suggest the particular burden of leadership roles that sometimes require choosing between wrongs rather than between right and wrong. This concept of dirty hands, Sophia explains, raises profound questions about moral purity and compromise. Some traditions emphasize the importance of keeping one's hands clean, avoiding direct moral transgressions regardless of consequences. Others suggest that willingness to accept moral taint may sometimes be necessary for responsible action in an imperfect world. This tension appears especially in political ethics, where effectiveness may sometimes require compromise with moral ideals. The village square now shows a public debate between these perspectives, some advocates emphasizing the importance of moral purity and principle, even at significant practical cost, others arguing for necessary compromise to achieve partial goods in non-ideal circumstances. Still others seeking intermediate positions that maintain core principles while engaging pragmatically with imperfect realities. This debate suggests the ongoing tension between moral idealism and practical effectiveness in addressing complex social problems. What makes these questions about compromise particularly difficult, Sophia observes, is determining where principled flexibility ends and moral corruption begins. When does necessary compromise with imperfect realities become unnecessary surrender of essential values? When does pragmatic acceptance of partial victories become complicity with injustice? These questions have no algorithm for resolution, but require ongoing, context-sensitive moral judgment. The village reveals the gradual transformation of various institutions and practices over time. Some changes representing genuine moral progress achieved through strategic compromise and persistent effort, others demonstrating the risk of moral erosion when initial compromises lead to gradually weakening standards. These contrasting trajectories suggest both the potential value and danger of moral compromise, depending on how it's approached and whether it serves as a tactical step toward greater justice or a surrender to what should be transformed. As we reflect on these dilemmas of competing obligations and necessary compromise, Sophia suggests, we might find wisdom in approaches that neither demand impossible moral purity nor surrender to cynical amoralism. Perhaps integrity in the face of competing claims involves not the absence of moral cost, but honest acknowledgement of it. Not perfect fulfillment of all obligations, but thoughtful prioritization based on the specific context, not rigid adherence to abstract principle regardless of consequences, but principled flexibility that maintains core values while engaging realistically with an imperfect world. The path through the village now passes a small sanctuary, not an imposing temple, but a modest space for reflection and renewal. Inside, you glimpse people engaged in practices that help sustain moral commitment amid complexity, acknowledging moral costs without becoming paralyzed by guilt, recommitting to core values while accepting the reality of compromise, finding sources of ethical renewal when difficult choices have exacted spiritual tolls. These practices suggest resources for maintaining moral integrity, not as perfect purity, but as honest engagement with complex realities. As we prepare to leave this village, Sophia says, consider one final dilemma that brings together these themes of competing obligations and moral compromise. Imagine someone who has made a significant commitment to a cause or institution they believe serves important values, perhaps a reformer working within a flawed political party, religious organization, or corporation. Over time, they discover that the compromises required to maintain their position and influence are greater than anticipated. At what point should they determine that the moral costs of continued involvement outweigh the potential good they might accomplish? How can they distinguish between necessary strategic compromise and problematic complicity? The village outskirts now show people at different stages of this discernment. Some maintaining involvement despite significant compromise because they believe their influence still serves important values. Others reaching breaking points where continued participation would require unacceptable moral compromise. Still others creating alternative paths that neither accept the status quo nor abandon engagement entirely. These diverse responses suggest the context-sensitive nature of discernment about when compromise serves integrity and when it undermines it. This dilemma, Sophia explains, highlights the dynamic, ongoing nature of moral navigation. Integrity doesn't consist in making a single correct choice that resolves all tension, but in maintaining an honest, reflective relationship with complex and evolving situations. It involves continuously reassessing whether our compromises serve our deeper values or have begun to corrupt them, whether we're making necessary concessions to reality or unnecessary surrenders to what could be transformed through greater moral courage. As you prepare to leave the village, you notice that the mobile beneath your feet has achieved not perfect balance, but a dynamic equilibrium, a continuous process of small adjustments that acknowledges competing pulls without surrendering to either rigid paralysis or unprincipled flexibility. This ongoing balancing suggests that moral wisdom in the face of competing obligations involves not discovering a formula that eliminates tension, but developing the capacity to navigate complexity with both principle and adaptability. As we leave this village, Sophia concludes, carry with you an appreciation for the inevitable complexity of moral life embedded in relationships and communities with competing legitimate claims. Rather than seeing this complexity as a failure of moral theory, we might understand it as a fundamental feature of human existence that calls forth distinctive virtues, practical wisdom, moral creativity, principled flexibility, and the capacity to acknowledge moral loss without surrender to cynicism or despair. The village of competing obligations gradually recedes behind you as your path leads toward what appears to be an unusual structure on the horizon, a building that seems to shift between different architectural styles as you watch, representing different cultural and historical approaches to moral questions. This transformative structure represents the next territory of moral exploration, where questions of cultural difference, moral change over time, and the tension between universal principles and contextual understanding await your consideration. Your journey through moral dilemmas continues, each territory adding depth and nuance to your understanding of the ethical landscape that defines humanity. As you approach the shape-shifting structure, its architectural metamorphosis becomes more apparent. At one moment, it appears as a Greek temple with classical columns and precise mathematical proportions. Then, it transforms into a soaring Gothic cathedral with intricate stonework and luminous stained glass. Next, it takes the form of a Buddhist stupa with its distinctive bell-shaped dome. Then, a traditional Japanese building with elegant simplicity and harmony with nature, followed by an Islamic mosque with geometric patterns and arabesque designs, before shifting to indigenous structures from various continents that embody entirely different relationships between humans, community, and the cosmos. "We have arrived," Sophia says, her voice now containing subtle harmonics, as if multiple tones were sounding simultaneously, "at the Hall of Cultural Perspectives, the realm where we confront questions about moral diversity across cultures and times, the tension between universal ethical principles and contextual understanding, and how we should approach moral disagreements that stem from fundamentally different worldviews. Are moral truths universal or culturally relative? How should we respond when deeply held values conflict across cultural boundaries? Can we maintain both respect for diversity and commitment to certain fundamental moral standards?" These questions become increasingly urgent in our interconnected global community. As you enter this remarkable structure, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed yet again. Now, they incorporate elements from diverse cultural traditions, yin-yang symbols, suggesting balance between complementary forces, dharma wheels representing cosmic order and righteousness, scales of justice from various legal traditions, indigenous circular patterns embodying harmony and right relationship. This multicultural representation suggests that ethical evaluation draws from many sources of wisdom rather than any single cultural framework. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine you're involved in international human rights work, addressing practices that violate what you consider universal moral standards, perhaps child marriage, female genital cutting, or harsh physical punishments for certain offenses. Yet you encounter communities where these practices are defended not as mere customs, but as expressions of deeply held values, collective welfare over individual rights, cultural continuity, religious obligation. How should you navigate this terrain without either abandoning commitment to basic human dignity or imposing your cultural values without understanding local moral frameworks? The hall shifts to display this scenario, showing both communities where these contested practices occur and the complex moral frameworks that sustain them, alongside advocates for universal human rights standards and the equally complex moral frameworks underlying these positions. You feel the tension between respecting cultural diversity and maintaining commitment to what seem like fundamental moral principles that should transcend cultural boundaries. This scenario, Sophia explains, illustrates the challenge of navigating between moral universalism, the view that at least some ethical principles apply across all cultural contexts, and moral relativism, the view that ethical judgments make sense only relative to particular cultural frameworks. Extreme versions of universalism risk imposing one culture's values on others without adequate understanding or respect for different moral perspectives. Extreme versions of relativism risk accepting harmful practices simply because they occur within a coherent cultural system. The hall now displays these contrasting approaches. One section representing a rigid universalism that applies identical standards across all contexts, regardless of cultural difference. Another depicting a strong relativism that treats all moral frameworks as equally valid within their cultural contexts. Between these extremes, the hall reveals more nuanced positions that attempt to navigate this complex terrain with both principle and sensitivity to context. A more balanced approach, Sophia continues, might acknowledge that while certain basic human values, like protection from unnecessary suffering, respect for human dignity, and some conception of fairness, appear across diverse cultures, their specific expressions and the priority given to different values vary significantly across traditions. This suggests the possibility of cross-cultural dialogue grounded in overlapping concerns while remaining open to learning from different emphases and interpretations. The hall transforms again to show a space for exactly this kind of dialogue. Representatives from diverse cultural traditions engaging in genuine exchange about their moral frameworks, seeking both areas of overlap and opportunities to learn from difference, working toward practices that might better realize shared human values while respecting legitimate cultural diversity. This dialogical space suggests possibilities beyond both rigid universalism and uncritical relativism. What complicates these cross-cultural moral questions further, Sophia notes, is the reality of power differentials between cultures and the history of colonialism that shapes contemporary interactions. When economically and politically dominant societies critique practices in less powerful communities, this occurs against a backdrop of historical impositions that understandably generates resistance. Yet appeals to cultural autonomy have sometimes been used by those in power within communities to deflect legitimate critique of oppressive practices. The hall now reveals these power dynamics, showing both historical patterns of colonial imposition under the guise of moral improvement and contemporary instances where appeals to cultural tradition serve to maintain internal hierarchies and prevent critical examination of harmful practices. These complications suggest that cross-cultural moral engagement requires attention not just to cultural difference, but to power relations both between and within communities. This attention to power, Sophia observes, connects to feminist approaches to cross-cultural ethics. Thinkers like Uma Narayan and Alison Jagger have argued that we should be suspicious of both Western dismissal of non-Western moral frameworks and uncritical celebration of traditional practices that often disproportionately constrain women's lives. They suggest that women within various cultural contexts have resources for internal critique that neither impose external standards nor accept the status quo uncritically. The hall shifts again to highlight these internal reform movements, showing how people within diverse traditions reinterpret their own cultural resources to address problematic practices while maintaining connection to their cultural identities. This approach suggests possibilities for moral critique that neither imposes external standards wholesale nor accepts all existing practices as beyond evaluation. Beyond questions of cultural difference, Sophia continues, similar issues arise regarding moral change over time within cultures. Consider how moral attitudes have shifted dramatically within societies regarding practices once widely accepted: slavery, denial of women's political rights, criminalization of homosexuality, corporal punishment of children. These changes raise profound questions about moral progress. Do such shifts represent genuine moral discovery, learning moral truths that were always valid but unrecognized? Or do they represent changes in moral frameworks themselves, suggesting that moral truth is not timeless, but evolves with human understanding. The hall's architecture now incorporates a temporal dimension, showing the evolution of moral attitudes within particular cultural traditions over time. The complex processes through which practices once considered acceptable came to be viewed as morally wrong. The interplay between changing material conditions, new philosophical perspectives, social movements, and shifts in moral perception. These historical transformations raise profound questions about the nature of moral truth and how we should understand our own moral certainties in light of historical change. This historical dimension, Sophia explains, creates humility about our current moral judgments. Just as past generations confidently held moral views we now consider grievously wrong, future generations may look back on some of our accepted practices with similar moral horror. This doesn't necessitate moral relativism, but does suggest appropriate recognition of our own limitations and the ongoing nature of moral understanding. The hall briefly presents a gallery of once common practices now widely condemned, showing how normal and justified they appeared to those within those historical contexts, how gradual or sometimes sudden shifts in moral perception transformed ethical evaluation of these practices, how moral reformers often seemed radical or extreme to their contemporaries. This historical perspective invites reflection on which currently accepted practices might undergo similar reevaluation in the future. These questions about cultural difference and historical change, Sophia observes, connect to deeper philosophical questions about the nature of moral truth itself. Is morality more like mathematics, discovering principles that exist independently of human cultures and perspectives? Or is it more like language, a human creation that evolves and varies across contexts while still having structure and serving vital human purposes? Different meta-ethical positions offer different answers to these fundamental questions. The hall now displays various philosophical approaches to understanding the nature of moral truth. Moral realism suggesting ethical principles exist independently of human recognition. Constructivism proposing that moral truths emerge through processes of reflective reasoning under appropriate conditions. Pragmatism focusing on ethics as evolving methods for addressing human problems rather than discovering eternal truths. These diverse meta-ethical perspectives suggest different ways of understanding both cross-cultural variation and historical change in moral attitudes. What makes these questions about cultural perspective more than abstract philosophical puzzles, Sophia suggests, is their practical significance for how we engage across difference in our diverse global community. Do we approach cross-cultural moral disagreements as opportunities to discover who is correct and who is mistaken about moral truth, or as occasions for mutual learning that might transform all participants' understanding? Do we seek universal principles that apply across all contexts, or develop approaches to cross-cultural ethics that maintain certain minimal standards while allowing for legitimate diversity beyond these? The hall transforms once more to display different modes of cross-cultural moral engagement, some focused on establishing and enforcing universal standards regardless of cultural context, others emphasizing dialogue and mutual transformation, still others seeking minimal consensus that allows maximal room for diversity beyond these basic agreements. These contrasting approaches suggest different balances between universal principle and respect for cultural difference in addressing shared moral challenges. As we navigate these questions, Sophia observes, we might find wisdom in approaches that maintain commitment to fundamental human values while remaining open to learning from diverse cultural expressions of these values. Perhaps certain basic moral concerns, preventing unnecessary suffering, respecting human dignity, allowing people voice in decisions that affect them, transcend cultural boundaries, while their specific articulation and implementation appropriately varies across contexts. This suggests the possibility of what philosopher Martha Nussbaum calls non-relativistic cultural sensitivity, maintaining universal concerns for human flourishing while engaging respectfully with diverse cultural expressions of these concerns. The central chamber of the hall now reveals a complex moral vision, neither imposing a single cultural framework as universal, nor accepting all cultural practices as beyond critique, but engaging in ongoing dialogue grounded in shared human concerns while remaining open to learning from diverse cultural wisdom. This approach suggests possibilities for moral engagement across difference that maintain both principle and openness to multiple perspectives. As we prepare to leave this hall, Sophia says, consider one final dilemma that brings together these themes of cultural perspective and moral evaluation. Imagine you're part of an international effort addressing climate change, bringing together representatives from nations with very different cultural values, historical relationships to nature, levels of development, and degrees of responsibility for the current crisis. How might you develop approaches to this shared challenge that acknowledge legitimate cultural and historical differences while maintaining commitment to the common good of humanity and the earth? What would respectful cross-cultural moral reasoning look like in addressing such a complex global issue? The hall's final chamber displays this global moral challenge, showing representatives from diverse cultural traditions bringing different values, priorities, and historical perspectives to a common existential threat, trying to forge approaches that acknowledge legitimate differences while building necessary common ground. This scenario suggests how abstract questions about universalism and relativism translate into concrete challenges of developing shared moral frameworks for addressing problems that transcend cultural boundaries. This dilemma, Sophia explains, points toward the ongoing nature of cross-cultural moral reasoning, not a matter of discovering final answers, but of developing better processes for engaging across difference to address shared human challenges. It suggests that wisdom might lie not in resolving the tension between universal principles and cultural diversity once and for all, but in learning to navigate this tension productively in specific contexts where different moral perspectives meet. As you prepare to leave the Hall of Cultural Perspectives, you notice that its architecture has stabilized into a structure that incorporates elements from diverse traditions without reducing them to uniformity, unity without homogeneity, diversity without fragmentation. This integrated yet diverse design suggests possibilities for moral understanding that acknowledges both what humans share across cultures and what varies legitimately between them, creating neither a rigid universal framework nor a fragmented relativism, but a dynamic moral ecology of both commonality and difference. As we leave this hall, Sophia concludes, carry with you an appreciation for both the diversity and commonality in human moral frameworks across cultures and times. Rather than seeing this complexity as an obstacle to moral understanding, we might recognize it as an opportunity for a richer, more nuanced ethical vision that draws from multiple cultural resources while maintaining commitment to basic human values that appear, albeit in different forms, across diverse traditions. The Hall of Cultural Perspectives gradually recedes behind you as your path leads toward what appears to be a vast network of interconnected chambers visible in the distance. This complex structure represents the next territory of moral exploration, where questions of technology ethics, future generations, and the expanding boundaries of moral consideration await your attention. Your journey through moral dilemmas continues, each territory adding depth and nuance to your understanding of the ethical landscape that defines humanity. As you approach the vast interconnected structure in the distance, its complexity becomes increasingly apparent. Unlike the architectural forms you've encountered previously, this network resembles a living system, constantly evolving, with new chambers forming while others transform or connect in novel ways. Some sections appear only partially constructed, their final form still emerging. Others shift between alternative possible configurations, as if representing futures not yet determined. The entire structure pulses with a subtle luminescence that flows through its connecting pathways, suggesting the transmission of information and influence throughout the system. "We have arrived," Sophia says, her voice now containing both ancient resonance and futuristic tones. "At the network of emerging challenges, the realm where we confront moral questions arising from technological transformation, expanding boundaries of moral consideration and responsibilities to future generations. How should we navigate unprecedented ethical terrain created by emerging technologies? What obligations do we have to beings and systems increasingly recognized as deserving moral consideration? How should present decisions account for their impact on generations not yet born? These questions require extending traditional moral frameworks into new domains while remaining grounded in enduring human values." As you enter this dynamic structure, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed yet again. Now they incorporate technological elements alongside organic components, circuitry intertwined with living tissue, algorithms processing alongside intuitive judgments, feedback loops connecting diverse value considerations. This hybrid representation suggests that addressing emerging moral challenges requires integrating traditional ethical wisdom with new forms of understanding appropriate to novel contexts. Consider this fundamental dilemma, Sophia suggests. Imagine you're developing artificial intelligence systems with increasing autonomy and capacity to affect human welfare, perhaps for healthcare diagnosis, criminal justice risk assessment, or resource allocation during crises. These systems promise significant benefits, but also create new risks, from encoded bias and diminished human agency to potentially catastrophic failures in critical applications. How should you navigate development of technologies whose full implications cannot be predicted in advance? What values should guide design when perfect safety cannot be guaranteed, but halting development might withhold substantial benefits? The network shifts to display this scenario, showing both extraordinary possibilities for human flourishing enabled by advanced technologies and sobering potential harms from their misapplication or unintended consequences. You feel the weight of decisions that must be made under conditions of substantial uncertainty, where both action and inaction carry significant moral risks. This scenario, Sophia explains, illustrates what philosophers Hans Jonas and Max Moore have called the imperative of responsibility in technological societies. Our obligation to ensure that the technologies we develop serve genuinely human ends and preserve conditions for authentic human flourishing in the future. But this imperative raises profound questions. Who defines human flourishing when technologies might transform human capacities and values themselves? How do we balance innovation against precaution when potential benefits and harms are both substantial but uncertain? What values should guide technological development when traditional moral frameworks didn't envision these possibilities? The network now displays contrasting approaches to these questions. One section representing strong precautionary principles that prioritize avoiding potential harms, even at significant cost to innovation, another depicting techno-optimism that emphasizes potential benefits while accepting inevitable risks. Still another showing middle paths that seek careful, value-guided innovation with appropriate safeguards. These diverse approaches suggest different ways of navigating the fundamental tension between technological progress and prudent caution. What complicates these technological dilemmas further, Sophia notes, is how they increasingly blur boundaries between categories once considered distinct: human and machine, therapy and enhancement, natural and artificial. Consider questions around human biotechnology. When does genetic modification for disease prevention become enhancement of non-pathological traits? How should we distinguish between restoring typical function and creating novel capacities? What happens to our understanding of human dignity when the given aspects of human nature become increasingly subject to technological modification? The network transforms to illustrate these blurring boundaries, showing the continuous spectrum between clearly therapeutic interventions and more controversial enhancements, the increasingly fuzzy distinction between assistive technologies and integrated human-machine systems, the challenge of maintaining meaningful concepts of human nature and dignity in context of accelerating technological transformation. These fluid boundaries suggest how emerging technologies don't just create new ethical questions, but transform the frameworks through which we approach moral reasoning itself. These boundary questions, Sophia continues, connect to deeper philosophical issues about the proper relationship between humanity and technology. Should technology primarily serve to fulfill existing human purposes, or is the transformation of human capacities and values itself a legitimate aim? Is there wisdom in accepting certain limitations as constitutive of the human condition, or does human dignity lie precisely in our capacity to transcend given constraints through technological creativity? Different philosophical and religious traditions offer contrasting perspectives on these fundamental questions. The network now displays these diverse perspectives, some chambers representing traditions that emphasize accepting natural limitations and finding meaning within them, others showing views that celebrate technological transcendence of biological constraints as fulfilling distinctively human creative potential. Still others depicting middle paths that affirm technological progress while maintaining commitment to certain boundaries derived from enduring human values. These contrasting approaches suggest different understandings of the proper relationship between technological capacity and moral wisdom. Beyond questions about human transformation, Sophia observes, emerging technologies also create unprecedented challenges regarding privacy, autonomy, and social justice. Consider dilemmas around surveillance and data collection. New technologies enable unprecedented monitoring of human behavior, promising benefits for security, public health, and personalized services, but potentially undermining privacy, autonomy, and democratic freedoms. Where should we draw boundaries around data collection and use? How do we balance legitimate uses of surveillance with preserving spaces free from monitoring? How can we ensure that benefits and risks of these technologies are distributed justly rather than reinforcing existing social inequalities? The network shifts again to reveal these societal dilemmas, showing how emerging technologies simultaneously create potential for both enhanced human freedom and unprecedented control, both more equitable distribution of benefits and exacerbation of existing inequalities, both strengthened community through connection and new forms of exploitation and manipulation. These complex possibilities suggest that technological ethics requires attention not just to individual impacts, but to broader social, political, and economic contexts that shape how technologies develop and who benefits from them. What makes these questions particularly challenging, Sophia notes, is their global and intergenerational scope. Decisions about technological development made in one region increasingly affect people worldwide and shape possibilities for generations to come. This expanded moral horizon raises questions about who should participate in technological governance and how we balance present interests against potential future impacts. Traditional democratic processes operate within national boundaries and prioritize current citizens, but technological impacts transcend these limitations. The network now expands dramatically to demonstrate this extended moral horizon, showing how technological decisions ripple outward across geographical space and forward through time, affecting beings distant from the point of decision in both location and temporal existence. This visualization suggests the inadequacy of moral frameworks that limit consideration to immediate, local impacts when addressing technologies with global and intergenerational implications. This expanded moral horizon, Sophia continues, connects to questions about our responsibilities to future generations. Consider climate ethics. Current actions profoundly shape the world future people will inhabit, yet these people cannot directly participate in present decisions. What principles should guide our choices when those most affected have no voice? How much weight should we give to uncertain but potentially catastrophic future impacts compared to more certain present costs? What obligations do we have to preserve options and resources for generations who don't yet exist? The network transforms once more to display this intergenerational moral landscape, showing pathways of influence extending from present decisions into multiple possible futures, some foreclosing options that might never be recovered, others preserving possibilities for future generations to make their own choices. This temporal extension suggests how present moral responsibility increasingly includes consideration of impacts on those who cannot yet advocate for themselves, but whose basic interests deserve protection. These questions about future generations, Sophia observes, raise deeper philosophical issues about the scope of moral consideration itself. Traditionally, ethics focused primarily on relations between existing humans, but expanding circles of moral concern now include future generations, non-human animals, and potentially even artificial intelligences that might develop morally relevant capacities. How far should this circle expand? What qualities merit direct moral consideration? How do we balance obligations to different types of beings when their interests conflict? The network now displays this expanding circle, showing extensions of moral consideration beyond traditional boundaries to include diverse beings with different capacities and relationships to humanity. This expanded moral community suggests the ongoing evolution of ethical understanding to encompass beings previously excluded from direct moral consideration. What makes these questions about emerging moral challenges more than abstract speculation, Sophia suggests, is their increasing urgency as technological development accelerates and human impacts on Earth systems become more profound. We lack the luxury of awaiting perfect theoretical resolution before making consequential decisions that will shape the future of humanity and the planet. This reality calls for approaches that acknowledge uncertainty and complexity while still providing practical guidance for present choices with far-reaching implications. The central chamber of the network now reveals different approaches to navigating this uncertainty, some emphasizing robust ethical constraints that establish boundaries regardless of potential benefits beyond these limits. Others focusing on maintaining option value by avoiding irreversible decisions wherever possible. Still others developing adaptive governance systems that continuously reassess and adjust as more information becomes available. These diverse approaches suggest different ways of making decisions under conditions of substantial uncertainty about potentially transformative developments. As we reflect on these emerging challenges, Sophia observes, we might find wisdom in approaches that neither uncritically embrace technological transformation nor reflexively resist it, that neither overestimate human foresight nor abdicate responsibility for anticipating potential consequences, that maintain commitment to enduring human values while recognizing that their specific expression may evolve in novel contexts. Perhaps addressing these unprecedented questions requires both ethical humility about the limits of our foresight and moral courage in establishing guidance despite these limitations. The network's pathways now illuminate to show a balanced approach, neither abandoning traditional moral wisdom nor rigidly applying it without adaptation to novel contexts, neither embracing a simplistic theory that claims to resolve all dilemmas nor surrendering to pure ad hoc judgment without guiding principles. This middle path suggests the possibility of moral reasoning that draws from traditional resources while developing new understanding appropriate to unprecedented challenges. As we prepare to leave this network, Sophia says, consider one final dilemma that brings together these themes of technological ethics, expanding moral consideration, and responsibility to the future. Imagine you're participating in decisions about developing artificial general intelligence, systems potentially capable of equaling or exceeding human cognitive capacities across domains. Such systems might help address humanity's greatest challenges or create unprecedented risks to human flourishing and autonomy. They might eventually develop characteristics that merit direct moral consideration themselves, and the path of development, once begun, might prove difficult to alter. How should humanity approach this possibility, which combines extraordinary potential benefits, profound risks, novel questions about the boundaries of moral consideration, and implications extending far into the future? The network's culminating chamber displays this profound challenge, showing the multiple dimensions of the AGI question, from immediate research governance to long-term questions about humanity's proper role in potentially creating new forms of morally considerable intelligence. This multifaceted scenario suggests how emerging technologies increasingly require integrating considerations of immediate impacts, long-term consequences, expanding boundaries of moral concern, and fundamental questions about humanity's proper role and purpose. This dilemma, Sophia explains, points toward the need for ethical approaches that can integrate multiple time horizons, diverse values, expanded boundaries of moral consideration, and fundamental uncertainty about potentially transformative developments. It suggests that addressing emerging moral challenges requires not just applying existing ethical frameworks, but potentially developing new moral resources adequate to unprecedented questions, drawing wisdom from diverse traditions while extending beyond them into genuinely novel territory. As you prepare to leave the network of emerging challenges, you notice that its structure continues to evolve Even as you observe it, new connections forming, alternative configurations appearing and dissolving, the overall system maintaining coherence while continuously incorporating novel elements. This dynamic quality suggests that moral understanding itself must remain adaptive in contexts of accelerating change, neither abandoning foundational values nor failing to develop new understanding appropriate to unprecedented challenges. As we leave this network, Sophia concludes, carry with you an appreciation for both the continuity and evolution in moral understanding as humanity faces emerging challenges. Rather than seeing novel moral questions as threats to ethical coherence, we might understand them as opportunities to develop richer, more comprehensive moral frameworks that preserve enduring wisdom while expanding to encompass new realities and possibilities. The network of emerging challenges gradually recedes behind you as your path leads toward what appears to be a quiet meadow bathed in the gentle light of early dawn. This tranquil space represents the beginning of our concluding reflections, where we will integrate insights from the various moral territories we've explored throughout our journey. The philosophical exploration reaches toward completion not through final answers to these enduring dilemmas, but through a deeper appreciation of the wisdom available through thoughtful engagement with the ethical questions that define our humanity. As you enter the meadow, the path beneath your feet becomes a gentle trail through tall grasses and wildflowers, swaying in a soft morning breeze. The atmosphere has a luminous quality, neither the darkness of night nor the full brightness of day, but the liminal space of dawn, where both reflection on what has passed and anticipation of what lies ahead naturally arise. The air carries the mingled scents of earth, flowers, and morning dew, creating a sensory experience of renewed clarity after the complex territories you've traversed. We have arrived, Sophia says, her voice now carrying a quality of gentle synthesis, at the meadow of integration, a space where we can gather the threads of understanding from our journey through moral territories and begin to weave them into a more coherent whole, not to resolve all tensions or eliminate all uncertainties, but to appreciate how these diverse moral landscapes relate to each other and what patterns of wisdom might emerge from considering them together. As you walk with Sophia through the dew-kissed meadow, you notice that the scales beneath your feet have transformed a final time. Now, they appear not as a single balance, but as an intricate web of interconnected weighing mechanisms, each representing different aspects of moral consideration, all influencing each other in complex feedback patterns. The whole system constantly seeking dynamic equilibrium rather than static resolution. This integrated representation suggests that comprehensive moral understanding involves not a single decision procedure, but a rich ecology of considerations in ongoing relationship. As we reflect on our journey, Sophia suggests, let's consider how the different moral territories we've explored illuminate each other. The trolley problem with which we began revealed the tension between consequentialist approaches focused on outcomes and deontological perspectives, emphasizing the moral significance of actions themselves. This foundational tension reappeared in different forms throughout our exploration, in questions of justice between utility and rights, in dilemmas of integrity between effectiveness and principle, in tensions between risk-taking and precaution when facing technological uncertainty. The meadow responds to these reflections, flowers of different colors briefly illuminating to represent these recurring patterns, creating a visual network of connections across the moral landscapes you've traveled. This living map suggests how seemingly distinct ethical questions often involve similar underlying tensions expressed in different contexts. Similarly, Sophia continues, our early exploration of the circle of moral concern, questions about who deserves direct moral consideration, found echoes in later territories. We encountered this boundary question in concerns about future generations in the city of justice, in tensions between partial and impartial perspectives at the crossroads of fortune, in cross-cultural ethical engagement in the hall of perspectives, and in emerging questions about artificial intelligence and non-human life in the network of challenges. The question of where to draw the circle of moral consideration and on what basis appears as a recurring pattern throughout ethical inquiry. The meadow's response deepens. Previously illuminated flowers, now connecting through threads of light that form a more explicit network, revealing how this fundamental question of moral boundaries appears across diverse contexts. The visualization suggests that understanding the structure of this question in one domain might provide insights applicable to others, despite their surface differences. What's particularly fascinating, Sophia observes, is how these different moral territories relate to each other not just through shared questions, but through complementary insights. The mirrors of self-knowledge revealed psychological realities that affect moral perception across all domains. The crossroads of fortune highlighted how luck and circumstance shape the context for all moral choice. The village of competing obligations showed how moral tensions that cannot be eliminated must nevertheless be navigated in practical life. Each territory offers perspectives that enrich our understanding of all the others. The meadow now reveals a three-dimensional lattice of connections, not just linking similar questions across contexts, but showing how insights from each territory provide resources for approaching dilemmas in others. This integrated structure suggests that comprehensive moral understanding draws from multiple frameworks and perspectives rather than attempting to reduce all ethical questions to a single approach. This integration doesn't eliminate the tensions we've encountered, Sophia explains, but helps us understand their structure and significance more clearly. Consider how different ethical frameworks, consequentialism focusing on outcomes, deontology emphasizing duties and rights, virtue ethics centered on character, care ethics highlighting relationship, each capture important aspects of moral experience that the others might miss. Rather than seeking a single, correct framework, wisdom might involve understanding both the distinctive contributions and the limitations of each, developing the discernment to draw appropriately from different approaches in different contexts. The meadow displays these frameworks not as competing alternatives, but as complementary perspectives, each illuminating aspects of moral reality that others might leave in shadow, together providing more comprehensive understanding than any could alone. This complementary relationship suggests moving beyond the search for a single perfect theory toward more integrative approaches to ethical understanding. Similarly, Sophia continues, we can appreciate how different levels of moral analysis offer complementary insights. Principle-based approaches provide valuable frameworks for consistent reasoning across cases, but may miss contextual factors crucial to particular situations. Casuistry, reasoning from paradigm cases to novel situations, offers sensitivity to context, but may lack coherent justification across diverse scenarios. Narrative ethics, understanding moral issues through the stories that give them meaning, provides rich appreciation of lived moral experience, but may struggle with systematic guidance. Integrative understanding draws from all these levels rather than privileging any single approach. The meadow responds by revealing topographical features previously unnoticed, hills and valleys representing different levels of moral analysis from abstract principle to concrete case, with pathways connecting these levels in multiple directions. This landscape suggests the importance of movement between levels of abstraction, from principle to case and back again, rather than remaining fixed at any single level of moral reasoning. As we integrate these insights, Sophia suggests, we might reconsider the nature of moral wisdom itself. Perhaps it consists not in discovering a perfect theory or decision procedure that resolves all dilemmas, but in developing more sophisticated understanding of the structures of moral questions and the resources available for addressing them. This doesn't eliminate difficulty or uncertainty. Genuine moral dilemmas involve tensions that cannot be dissolved without moral loss, but it can help us navigate complexity with greater clarity and integrity. The meadow's integration deepens, the entire landscape now pulsing with patterns that reveal both the persistent tensions in moral life and the resources available for navigating them. These patterns suggest that wisdom involves not transcending moral complexity, but developing greater capacity to engage it productively, recognizing both the reality of conflicting values and the possibility of responses that honor the legitimate claims of each. What's particularly valuable about this integrative understanding, Sophia observes, is how it helps us avoid common pitfalls in moral reasoning. The tendency to reduce complex ethical questions to a single dimension, focusing exclusively on consequences, or rights, or virtue, or care. The impulse to seek theoretical purity at the expense of practical wisdom. The temptation to eliminate tension by simply dismissing legitimate values that compete with our preferred focus. Integration doesn't eliminate the need for difficult choices, but helps ensure these choices are made with awareness of what's at stake and the diverse considerations involved. The meadow now reveals common patterns of oversimplification. Flowers briefly wilting when disconnected from the broader network, representing how moral reasoning diminishes when artificially restricted to single frameworks or considerations. By contrast, areas where multiple perspectives remain in dynamic relationship display particularly vibrant growth, suggesting how integration enriches rather than reduces moral understanding. This integration also helps us appreciate distinct virtues needed for different moral contexts, Sophia continues. The courage required to face trolley-type dilemmas, where harm cannot be avoided completely but must be minimized. The justice essential to creating fair social arrangements in the city. The integrity necessary to maintain coherence between values and actions in the temple. The humility appropriate when confronting the role of luck at the crossroads. The honesty required for genuine self-knowledge in the Hall of Mirrors. The creativity needed to navigate competing obligations in the village. The openness essential to cross-cultural understanding in the Hall of Perspectives. The foresight required to address emerging challenges in the network. As Sophia names each virtue, corresponding areas of the meadow briefly illuminate, suggesting how different moral contexts call forth distinctive qualities of character. This visualization suggests that full moral development involves cultivating not just a single virtue, but a rich ecology of moral capacities appropriate to the diverse challenges we face. Perhaps most importantly, Sophia observes, integration helps us maintain balance between seemingly opposing but actually complementary moral attitudes, between conviction about core values and openness to revision in light of new understanding, between recognition of human moral limitations and commitment to moral progress, between appreciation for tradition and willingness to develop new ethical resources for unprecedented challenges, between appropriate humility about our moral knowledge and necessary courage in acting despite uncertainty. Wisdom often lies in maintaining creative tension between these poles rather than collapsing to either extreme. The meadow now reveals these balanced tensions, areas where opposing qualities maintain dynamic relationship rather than either dominating or dissolving into compromise. These balanced regions display particularly rich flowering, suggesting that moral vitality emerges precisely from maintaining creative tension rather than seeking false resolution through oversimplification. As we prepare to complete our journey, Sophia says, I'd like to offer a thought experiment that brings together many threads from our exploration, a dilemma that invites integrative moral reasoning rather than application of any single framework or principle. Imagine you find yourself in a position of significant but limited influence regarding a complex social challenge, perhaps addressing climate change, economic inequality, healthcare access, or technological governance. You recognize multiple legitimate values at stake, numerous stakeholders with valid perspectives, genuine uncertainty about outcomes, difficult trade-offs between short and long-term considerations, and institutional constraints on possible actions. How might the integrative understanding we've developed inform your approach to such multifaceted moral terrain? The meadow transforms one final time to display this integrative challenge, showing a complex moral landscape where consequential decisions must be made despite incomplete information, competing values, diverse perspectives, and institutional limitations. Unlike earlier scenarios with clearer structure, this challenge deliberately embodies the messy reality of most significant moral problems in their full complexity. This scenario, Sophia explains, invites neither simplistic application of a single ethical theory nor surrender to pure intuition or expediency. Instead, it calls for integrative moral reasoning that draws from multiple frameworks while acknowledging their limitations, that considers diverse perspectives without assuming all are equally valid, that recognizes both the reality of uncertainty and the necessity of responsible action despite it, that balances commitment to core values with openness to revision and compromise where appropriate. The meadow's response to this integrative challenge is particularly vibrant, its entire ecosystem seeming to participate in modeling what such holistic moral reasoning might involve. Different plants represent diverse considerations coming into dynamic relationship, their growth patterns suggesting how these considerations might be balanced without any single factor dominating completely. The overall ecosystem demonstrating both differentiation of distinct elements and integration into a coherent whole. What this integrative approach offers, Sophia suggests, is not a formula that eliminates the difficulty of moral dilemmas or the necessity of judgment in addressing them. Rather, it provides richer resources for engaging complexity with both principle and flexibility, both conviction and humility, both clarity about core values and openness to diverse perspectives. It acknowledges the reality of moral tragedy, that sometimes all available options involve genuine loss, while still affirming the possibility of choices that better honor the legitimate values at stake. The meadow now reveals pathways through the integrative challenge. Not a single correct route, but multiple viable approaches that navigate complexity with integrity, each embodying slightly different balances among the values involved, but all demonstrating thoughtful engagement with the full moral terrain rather than simplistic reduction or unprincipled expediency. These diverse paths suggest that integrative moral reasoning allows for legitimate plurality of responses rather than a single correct answer in complex contexts. As the sun continues to rise on our meadow of integration, Sophia concludes, we can see more clearly how the various moral territories we've traversed relate to each other and what patterns of wisdom emerge from considering them together. Not perfect resolution of all tensions, but deeper understanding of their structure and significance. Not elimination of moral difficulty, but richer resources for navigating it with integrity. Not final answers to enduring questions, but more nuanced appreciation of what's at stake in addressing them. The meadow now appears fully illuminated in the strengthening dawnlight, its integrated ecosystem revealing patterns of relationship that weren't visible in darkness. This illumination doesn't eliminate complexity or difficulty, but allows clearer perception of both the challenges and resources available for addressing them, a fitting metaphor for moral understanding itself, which clarifies without simplifying the complex terrain of human ethical life. As we prepare to leave this meadow, Sophia says, and complete our journey through moral dilemmas, let's carry forward this integrative vision, not as a finished system that resolves all questions, but as an evolving understanding that helps us engage more wisely with the ethical challenges that define our humanity. For it is precisely in wrestling with these dilemmas, rather than avoiding or oversimplifying them, that we most fully express and develop our moral nature. The meadow of integration gradually transitions around you as the path leads toward what appears to be a quiet hilltop bathed in the full light of sunrise. This elevated vantage point represents our final destination, where we'll conclude our journey with reflections on the broader significance of moral dilemmas in human life and their relationship to finding meaning amid complexity and uncertainty. As you ascend the gentle slope toward the hilltop, the quality of light around you transforms completely. The transitional illumination of dawn gives way to the clear, golden radiance of early morning. The air feels remarkably clear, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass and wildflowers. From this elevated vantage point, you can see far in every direction, back across the diverse moral territories you've traversed throughout the night, and outward toward landscapes not yet explored, but now visible in the distance. We have reached our journey's end, Sophia says, her voice now carrying a quality of completion without finality. This hilltop of reflection, where we can consider the broader significance of moral dilemmas in human life and what they reveal about our nature and possibilities. What does our capacity to recognize and wrestle with ethical complexity tell us about ourselves? How might engaging with these questions, even without perfect resolution, contribute to living more meaningful, integrated lives? What attitudes and approaches might help us navigate moral complexity with both conviction and humility? As you stand beside Sophia on this sunlit promontory, you notice that the scales that have accompanied your journey in various forms are now visible in the landscape itself. Valleys and ridges forming natural balances, streams finding equilibrium through their flow, trees stretching between earth and sky in gravitational counterpoint. This integrated vision suggests that moral balancing is not something imposed on reality, but emerges from its fundamental nature, with human ethical reasoning participating in patterns that permeate existence itself. As we look back across our journey, Sophia suggests, one insight stands out with particular clarity. Moral dilemmas are not failures or defects in ethical understanding, but windows into the genuine complexity of human life and values. When we face situations where legitimate goods conflict, where individual rights tension against collective welfare, where justice requires balancing competing claims, where integrity involves navigating conflicting obligations, we encounter not confusion, but reality in its full richness. The very existence of these tensions reflects the diversity of values that make human life meaningful. The hilltop vista reveals how the various moral territories you've explored exist not in isolation, but in dynamic relationship. The trolley dilemmas connecting to questions of justice relating to integrity linked to moral psychology, multiple frameworks together creating a complex but coherent moral ecology. This integrated landscape suggests that the diversity of ethical questions reflects not fragmentation, but the multifaceted nature of human moral experience itself. This perspective, Sophia continues, offers an alternative to common responses to moral complexity. Some seek refuge in ethical systems that reduce all moral questions to a single principle, maximizing utility, respecting rights, developing virtue, simplifying difficult dilemmas, but often at the cost of neglecting legitimate values that don't fit neatly into the chosen framework. Others surrender to moral relativism or skepticism, concluding that persistent disagreement and complexity prove ethics ultimately subjective or arbitrary. The integrated understanding we've developed suggests a third path, recognizing moral complexity as reflecting genuine pluralism of values, while maintaining that thoughtful, principled navigation of this complexity remains both possible and necessary. The hilltop reveals both the limitations of single principle approaches, visible as paths that traverse only portions of the moral landscape while bypassing others, and the inadequacy of relativistic surrender, which appears as directionless, wandering without orientation to any moral features. Between these, you see the integrative path of your own journey, acknowledging complexity while maintaining commitment to thoughtful engagement with it, recognizing plurality of values without concluding that moral orientation is merely subjective or arbitrary. What's particularly significant, Sophia observes, is how our capacity to recognize and wrestle with moral dilemmas reveals something profound about human nature itself. Unlike simpler organisms that respond to environment through instinct alone, we possess the remarkable ability to reflect on our values, to recognize tensions between them, to imagine alternative possibilities, and to make choices based on considerations beyond immediate self-interest. This capacity for moral reflection and choice, even amid uncertainty and complexity, forms a central aspect of human freedom and dignity. The hilltop offers a view of humanity's distinctive place in the landscape, neither completely determined by natural forces nor entirely separate from them, but capable of a particular kind of reflective relationship with reality that includes moral perception and choice. This unique position suggests that engaging with ethical complexity isn't peripheral to human existence, but central to expressing our distinctive nature and possibilities. This connection between moral engagement and human flourishing, Sophia continues, appears in diverse wisdom traditions, though expressed in different ways. Aristotle suggested that developing practical wisdom to navigate ethical complexity is essential to eudaimonia, not just happiness, but full human flourishing. Buddhist traditions emphasize how developing moral awareness leads toward liberation from suffering. Confucian thought connects ethical cultivation with harmony in personal and social life. Aboriginal wisdom traditions link moral relationship with land and community to both individual and collective well-being. Despite their differences, these traditions converge in recognizing that wrestling with questions of right relationship and action isn't separate from the good life, but constitutive of it. The Hilltop now reveals how various wisdom traditions have developed along different slopes of the moral landscape, each offering distinctive insights and practices while participating in the common human project of seeking orientation amid ethical complexity. This diversity suggests not that moral truth is merely relative to tradition, but that different cultural approaches illuminate different aspects of a complex but shared human endeavor. What this connection between moral engagement and human flourishing suggests, Sophia observes, is that the very process of wrestling with ethical questions, even without achieving perfect certainty or eliminating all tension, contributes to living more meaningful, integrated lives. When we engage seriously with moral dilemmas, we develop qualities essential to flourishing: attentiveness to what matters, sensitivity to others' experiences and perspectives, capacity to balance competing values, ability to act with integrity amid complexity, and humility about the limits of our understanding. The practice of moral reflection and choice itself cultivates the character that makes good human life possible. The Hilltop shows how the journey itself, the process of traversing diverse moral territories, engaging with different frameworks and perspectives, wrestling with genuine dilemmas, has value beyond any particular conclusions reached. This visualization suggests that moral development involves not just arriving at correct answers, but cultivating the capacities that enable thoughtful, nuanced engagement with ethical complexity throughout life. This understanding, Sophia continues, might help us develop more constructive attitudes toward moral disagreement itself. When we recognize that ethical questions often involve legitimate tensions between genuine values, disagreement appears less as a battle between right and wrong and more as an opportunity to develop fuller understanding through engaging diverse perspectives. This doesn't mean all moral positions are equally valid. Some clearly fail to acknowledge important values or experiences, but it does suggest that many significant moral disputes involve different weightings of legitimate considerations rather than simply correct versus incorrect views. The Hilltop reveals moral disagreements not primarily as combat between opposing forces, but as different navigational approaches through complex terrain, some more comprehensive and balanced than others, but many capturing genuine aspects of the moral landscape from particular vantage points. This perspective suggests that ethical progress often involves integration of diverse insights rather than simple victory of one position over all others. As we prepare to conclude our journey, Sophia says, I'd like to offer a final thought experiment that brings together these reflections on moral complexity and human flourishing. Imagine looking back on your life from its conclusion, considering not particular decisions, but your overall approach to navigating moral complexity. What qualities and practices would you wish to have cultivated? What attitudes toward ethical questions would reflect both principled commitment and appropriate humility? How might engaging with moral dilemmas, even without perfect resolution, have contributed to a life of meaning, integrity, and genuine human excellence? The Hilltop offers a perspective that transcends particular moral decisions to reveal broader patterns of relationship with ethical questions throughout a lifetime. This elevated view suggests that what matters most isn't achieving perfect resolution of every dilemma, but developing constructive, integrative approaches to moral complexity that support both principled action and ongoing growth in understanding. This perspective, Sophia explains, invites attention to developing certain qualities that support navigating moral complexity with wisdom, intellectual humility that acknowledges the limitations of our understanding while still seeking truth, moral courage to act on conviction despite uncertainty, integrity that maintains core commitments while engaging openly with diverse perspectives, compassion that recognizes the human reality behind abstract principles, patience with the gradual, imperfect nature of moral development, and hope that principled engagement with difficult questions can lead toward greater wisdom and flourishing, even without perfect resolution. The hilltop reveals how these qualities create not a fixed moral position, but a dynamic, evolving relationship with ethical questions, one that maintains principled orientation while remaining open to growth and refinement through ongoing engagement with diverse perspectives and experiences. This approach suggests that moral wisdom involves not arriving at a final destination, but developing capacities for thoughtful navigation of an inherently complex terrain. What this integrated understanding offers, Sophia suggests, is neither moral certainty that eliminates complexity nor relativism that abandons the search for wisdom, but resources for engaging ethical questions with both conviction and humility, both principle and flexibility, both commitment to core values and openness to diverse perspectives. It acknowledges the reality that moral dilemmas often involve genuine tensions that cannot be eliminated without loss, while affirming that thoughtful, integrative approaches can help us navigate these tensions with greater wisdom and integrity. The sunrise has now fully illuminated the hilltop and the diverse moral landscape visible from it. This clear yet gentle light doesn't eliminate complexity or difficulty, but allows more comprehensive perception of both challenges and resources, representing the kind of moral clarity that comes not from oversimplification, but from more nuanced, integrated understanding of ethical questions in their full richness. As our journey comes to its close, Sophia concludes, remember that the moral dilemmas we've explored aren't merely philosophical puzzles, but windows into what makes us distinctively human. Our capacity to perceive and wrestle with questions of value, meaning, and right relationship. When we engage these questions thoughtfully, we participate in one of humanity's most profound and distinctive activities, the ongoing conversation about how to live well, individually and together, amid the complex, sometimes tragic, but ultimately meaningful reality we inhabit. As Sophia's final words resonate across the hilltop, you feel a profound sense of completion without closure, recognition that while your journey through specific moral territories has reached its end, the broader human project of engaging ethical questions continues. The diverse landscapes you've explored, the frameworks you've considered, the tensions you've recognized, and the integrative understanding you've developed provide resources for this ongoing engagement, not perfect resolution of all dilemmas, but richer, more nuanced approaches to navigating them with wisdom and integrity. The morning light continues to strengthen around you, illuminating both where you've been and territories yet to be explored. You feel neither the disorientation of moral confusion nor the rigid certainty that denies complexity, but a centered alertness, a balanced receptivity to the genuine challenges and possibilities of ethical life. As you prepare to carry these reflections into sleep or into waking hours, whichever awaits you now, you sense that the moral dilemmas you've considered will continue to unfold within you, inviting ongoing exploration of the questions that define our humanity and the wisdom available through engaging them with both conviction and humility, both principle and openness to growth. The journey ends here on this sunlit hilltop, yet in another sense it continues indefinitely, for the exploration of moral dilemmas that define humanity remains an ongoing human project, one that expresses our highest capacities and deepest aspirations, connecting us across cultures and generations in the shared endeavor of seeking to live with wisdom, integrity, and meaning amid the beautiful complexity of human existence.